What happens when one man tries to watch all of the sci-fi films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project. Welcome back to the Sci-Fi Project, and if you're just joining us, we don't just cover sci-fi films here. This is sort of where I do all of the rest of the genre films. So you're going to see sci-fi here, but you're also going to see fantasy, you're going to see kaiju flicks, you're going to see superhero stuff, all of the things that don't fit under horror, which I cover over on the regular 80s Project. And yeah, we're going into 1984, which has quite a few really top-notch projects. So let's just jump right in and see what this year has to bring. The Sci-Fi of '84 begins in Italy, and we start on January 28th with a little ditty called Warriors of the Year 2072. We start off in the future in a very Blade Runner-looking city, and it's 2072, of course, and we see a televised gladiator show called Kill Bike that runs in the US. Meanwhile, in Rome, the head of a rival network called WBS is angry about the competitor show's popularity and their big champion, a guy named Drake. WBS's top show is something called The Danger Game, in which a person is strapped into a machine and put through death scenarios in their head, and if they can keep their cool, they win. Meanwhile, Drake gets married to an American TV star, and WBS head Cortez gets the order to put together their own gladiator game TV show within 40 days. He's given a roster of death row inmates from around the world to pick from, and one of them turns out to be Drake himself after he kills a couple of guys who have broken into his house and murdered his wife, whistling while they do it. They're all brought in and have these bracelets burned into their wrists to track them, and he meets his fellow contestants. One is Monk with a scarred face, and there's also good old Al Cliver, and Fred Williamson, and Hal Yamanuchi, the three fellows who knew their way around an Italian ripoff flick. After a good chunk of training, escape attempts, and punishment, Drake is helped out by one of the execs that discovers that there's a little more to his crime than was previously thought. Finally though, the contest begins with the crew geared up and on tricked out motorcycles, beginning the first of a number of battles to the death. And I know that we've been talking about a lot of Mad Max ripoffs and Escape from New York ripoffs in the previous years, and this is definitely one of them, but it's also doing its own thing. None other than the horror master Lucio Fulci was brought in to direct, but he ended up clashing with the producers non-stop about the vision for the film. Their disputes got to the point that they ended up taking him to court, and he had been set to make another film with them called Last Starfighter. After the suit, they ended up still making the film without Fulci, but due to the case, had to change the script, and the only thing that remained was the title, as it was originally going to be a post-apocalyptic film, and instead was released as a straightforward action flick. This one would end up getting released under a handful of different titles, including Rome 2072 AD, The New Gladiators, Fighting Centurions, Rome 2033, The Fighter Centurions, and also just The New Gladiators. It wouldn't make as big of a splash as the director's horror work, but still did pretty well and had some decent reviews, but was mostly negative. And I'm a sucker for some Fulci, so this gets a 3.5. I think it's pretty fun, even if the middle portion is a bit of a drag. I just wish that there was some more time given to the games and such, but I like what it's doing, and there's like a low-rent charm to those city models. The sci-fi cultural significance is a 2, since it's not all that well known, but it's got some known faces in there, and gets an extra push just from being from Fulci, even if it's not one of his bigger projects. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, it's Lucio.
3, 2, 1, 0, they're up!
This next one is another international entry since we're headed over to France on February 8th, although it's a very American-infused production, even if it didn't arrive here until 1985, and it's Gwendoline, or, I suppose, The Perils of Gwendoline in the Land of the Yik Yak. It begins in a Chinese port as a trio of thieves open a container and find a human woman inside and kidnap her. They sell her off to a local gangster, but luckily she's rescued by dashing rogue Willard. Oh, and meanwhile, the woman is Gwendoline, but you're more used to seeing her dancing around the hood of a car in the still of the night. After she's rescued...
You have big blue eyes, long white hands.
I have never really heard anyone compliment someone's hands on their whiteness. Or longness. Is having long hands a desirable trait or something? It seems that Gwendoline is looking for her father and a rare butterfly that he was searching for, and her maid have traveled across the world. They convince Willard to assist them, and they find a man that says that it can be found in the land of the Yik Yak, a sort of lost area. They head out by boat, running into marauders along the way, and it's clearly rocking that Indiana Jones vibe for this portion and is mostly just an action film. But don't worry, the sci-fi and fantasy stuff is on its way. After some flirtation and casual nudity, Willard and Gwendoline have some sparks fly with, straw? But then things take a drastic turn when they finally track down that elusive flutterby and end up in some sort of underground city with female soldiers in what looks like Dune garb and big machines. They then need to rescue Beth and find their quarry, all while wearing, well, thongs. So this one was a French film and directed by a guy named, and I'm not making this up, Just Jackin. He was known for doing softcore films that were adaptations of famous stories like the original Emmanuel, The Story of O, and Lady Chatterley's Lover. You know, just Jackin did those. This one was also a version of a printed tale based on a series of bondage-themed comics of a character called Sweet Gwendoline. This was a very early point in Katayan's career as well, and would be her first film role, with her only previous gigs being TV shows. This version of the film, the French version, was simply called Gwendoline, but was retitled to The Perils of Gwendoline in the Land of the Yik Yak for American release in January of '85 and had close to 20 minutes chopped out. It skipped the theater here, going straight to video and cable, but formed a cult following pretty damn quick, as soon as Tawny's star started to rise, and this film featured several scenes of her in the nude. And this isn't great, but it is pretty damn fun, so I'll give it a 3. It's goofy and campy, and it feels like you're watching several movies at once, but at least they're never dull. The SFCS is a 2 though, since it's not much reputed, but did have some known faces and did get that cult success for a while. Should you watch it? I'd say yes, it's certainly not that perilous.
Hey, you guys okay? You're not dead or anything?
Let's stay over in Europe and pop over to West Germany now for a film that's debuted there on February 19th and get weird with Decoder. It begins with a man in a government facility that seems to be monitoring people, and everything is told in a very odd, fractured way, with mostly just music, like a distorted music video, and some occasional shocking imagery on the screen. There's also this little burger joint where the local teens hang out, and this strip club that the agent frequents, and the two intersect when one of the dancers there is involved with a guy who calls himself a noise enthusiast. She tells a story about a wasteland, and there's an old man there, walking with a cane, with a very distinct voice.
Fading into the cold spring air, pose a colorless question.
At one point, FM overhears the burger shop manager tell an employee not to play a particular tape and sees how the music playing affects the diners. And I guess I should point out that FM is played by FM Einheit, a former member of the classic industrial noise group Einstürzende Neubauten. His journey leads him to an underground church where the preacher is Genesis P. Orridge from Psychic TV and discovers that a certain tape playing a certain noise will trigger people's instincts to riot and begin a revolution. So, this one is weird. Really weird. It's by a man named Musha, and this was his second and final feature film, both of which were avant-garde music-based works. It was based on the works of writer William S. Burroughs, and he's featured in the film as that old man in the visions. It's not adapting a specific Burroughs work as much as it is trying to capture the vibes of his writings. This was a time of a lot of unrest in Germany, and most of the footage of the riots happening in the film is actual news footage from the time. It was made for a rather low budget, although no numbers are listed, and it never really made it past the art film world in terms of popularity, and became a sort of a lost film for a few decades. There were copies of it out there, but no one really talked about it or remembered it existed until recently, when it was given a new transfer and release. And maybe I'm partial to Burroughs stuff, or maybe it's my love of 80s industrial music, but this is a 3.5. Like, sure, it's what some would call pretentious, and I'm sure it'll be called boring, but I dig it, and the mood that it's putting down. The SFCS is just a 1 though, since it's really obscure at this point, and one that no one talks about, and didn't impact the scene at all. Like, maybe the music scene a bit, but certainly not the film one. Should you watch it? If what I described sounds cool, then yes. If it sounds artsy-fartsy, well, it is. The next one is one of those entries that doesn't have a confirmed release date, and all that's known is that it was released in Italy sometime in '84, and it's A Man Called Rage. If it's in this time frame and it's from Italy, chances are that it's in a post-apocalyptic world, and we see mushroom clouds in the beginning, so yep. There's a small group of soldiers skulking about, slowly being taken out by unseen forces, but there's also mutants about. They appear to be after this man in a black t-shirt, and they finally manage to capture him, making sure to take him alive. Along the way, their truck is ambushed by guys, and including this one that looks like he stole Gilligan's wardrobe, but they're able to defeat them by teaming up. Eventually, they get him back to some sort of research facility, where we find out that his name is Captain Strike, but his nickname is apparently Rage. He's met by deep discount Sean Connery and recruited to find some sort of lost base, and Rage says that he was the lone survivor of his unit, and some disease ravaged his friends, and is quite mad that they didn't let him into their little secret city. They want him to find it and a stash of uranium that they plan to use to save mankind, and he reluctantly agrees, and they head out into the Forbidden Lands, and they enlist the help of a man named Slash, named for a large scar on his face, and they go out in search, facing down marauders that attack them while the most inappropriate music possible plays. But it turns out that Slash betrays them, and then it's a race against time for these two groups to find that uranium. And like a bunch of other films from this early 80s era, this is a ripoff of several different things. It's a pinch of Escape from New York, a bit of Mad Max, and it was directed by Tonino Ricci. We've already encountered him here on the Sci-Fi project with 1983's Thor the Conqueror, and also on the horror project with 1982's Bacterion. And he also did an action flick in '83 called Rush that did have some sci-fi elements that I likely should have included on the Sci-Fi project, but it also featured Bruno Minetti as the main character. So some countries released this as Rush 2, even though they're not connected, and Bruno does indeed play a different character. And this is, okay, it's a 2. It's stuff that we've all seen before, but it's done well enough, although it has one of the most eye-rolling endings I've seen in a while when it's discovered what they're really after. The significance is a 1 since it's really obscure and doesn't break any new ground, but it's just doing that whole Mad Max thing again. Should you watch it? Probably not. You've seen this all before, although it's not a terrible watch by any means.
Cryonic cell?
Yeah.
Radioactivity?
0 level, apparently.
It looks like we're going back to West Germany because 3 days later, on February 22nd, another sci-fi oriented flick arrived with the Noah's Ark principle. It starts in 1997, the far, far future, in Pennsylvania, and we have an astronaut named Billy returning from a stint on a space station, but it seems like something happened up there, and he's being blamed for it. We then flash back to the Florida Arc Lab, an experimental station that was being used to control the weather and was a joint project between the US and Europe. Billy's up there and mentions his friend Max, and they bond over raising frogs and having them jump on their faces, which is a unique bond. Max has a wife down on Earth named Eva, but he hasn't seen her in a while, and it seems like this is an alternate Earth, and the world here is mostly at peace and has given up weapons of mass destruction. However, tensions between the US and Russia are starting to rise, and they're suddenly given a message to irradiate an area of Earth. But whoops, it seems like they don't really know who gave that order, and it appears as if the burst of radiation has increased the Cold War going on below. There's then a bunch of problems with Max's love life and whether or not he's a spy, and damage to their own ship that needs repaired. And more complications arrive when Eva herself shows up at the space station with another agent. But who's working for who here? And yep, this one is German, West German to be specific, because this is pre-wall coming down, and the story here is pretty wild. This is a student film. Yes, you heard that right, but not just any student. This is the debut feature film for Roland Emmerich, future director of Universal Soldier, Stargate, Independence Day, and Fozilla. He made this movie after attending film school in Germany as his thesis project. It said that the standard budget for the project at the school at this time was around 20,000 Deutschmark, but Emmerich wanted to go bigger. Star Wars' success had convinced him that sci-fi was the way to go and that people were interested in space films, and was able to raise over 1 million Deutschmark from various investors, making it Germany's most expensive student project of all time. The entire thing was filmed in an abandoned washing machine factory with parts of sets built to look like their ship, but the close quarters is likely why most of the film is shot in close-ups. There's not much information about the release and how well it did, but it did get some critical acclaim and helped get Emmerich noted by American studios. And it's alright, I'm going for a 2.5. I want to give it higher for the sheer ambition of this being a student project and being this big, but it's so damn dry and lacks drama and character. The SFCS is a 1.5 since it's not well known at all in the US, but I'll give it a slight boost for kicking off Emmerich's career, and he'd go on to be a major player. Should you watch it? From a curiosity standpoint, maybe, but there's not a whole lot to the story.
Durchschmelzen des Reaktors. Achtung, noch etwa 3 Minuten.
We're going back into the land of the unconfirmed dates and headed over to Australia for this next one that came out just sometime in '84, and it's weird, and it's future Schlock. We're set in some far future where at some point there were class wars and individualism has been wiped out and everyone looks and acts the same and has the same life goals. They all strive to own a Betamax, so this is clearly the better future, and they long to go to shopping malls. But then there's the lower classes, who they've shoved into ghettos and fenced in, and they call the middle class the subbies, suburbanites. But there's two guys, the Cisco Kid and Poncho, and they run loose and cause trouble with the cops. There's a bartender narrating it all, and he runs a bar where Sarah and Bear perform while wearing Mad Max-inspired makeup, and it turns out that they're also Cisco and Poncho. They spend their time dressing up like subbies and heading out into the world to cause chaos, like telling them that they have to move if they live in a house with fake brick, and getting police to randomly start beating people, and come on, do they really need convincing? It's then just a random assortment of adventures as Sarah and the bear stir things up and make a new girlfriend, while the authorities hone in on their alter egos. So, this is by a duo that both wrote and directed, and they're Chris Keeley and Barry Peake, and together they made 4 films, and 2 of them were sci-fi oriented. They were both in charge of a famous art house theatre in Melbourne called the Valhalla Cinema, and it became known as the coolest place in Australia to show cult films. This movie was designed to play exclusively in their theaters, as they had several throughout the continent. The budget was pretty low at around $80,000, but ended up being a flop, and only earned back half of that. In order to save some money on storage costs, the team ended up destroying the original negatives, which meant that the only versions that still exist are rips from VHS from the 80s, so the quality is not that great. And I'm just going with a 2 on this one. Honestly, I thought it would be right up my alley, but I found it grating, and the comedy doesn't work, and the satire elements are really poorly developed. The SFCS is just a 1 since it's unknown in the States and was even a flop in its own country with no recognizable faces. Should you watch it? Probably not. I imagine this will appeal to some, but I was not one of those people.
So you're a grubby one? Then your body's balls off.
Our first block of the year ends in a pretty spectacular way as we go back to the US for a film that debuted on March 2nd, even though it did play at a film festival in Berlin in February, but it's Repo Man. This starts with a cop pulling over a man and looks in his trunk, only to then be blasted by a beam of light and disintegrated. We're then in a supermarket, and a high school wrestler is here and gets fired from his job, and he's a punk. He gets cheated on, and the next day is approached by a space trucker and convinced to move a car, which just so happens to belong to someone else. And hey, Bud is a Repo Man, and they offer him a job. At first he says no, but after eating generic food, because everything in this film is generic brand, he changes his mind. Meanwhile, that car from the intro comes rolling into the city, and Otto meets a young woman named Layla who says that she has proof aliens exist and people are after her. He encounters the other Repo Men, including Bob the Goon, who's convinced that there's flying saucers out there that are actually time machines. There's a 20 grand marker on that Malibu from the beginning, so the various squads of Repo Men are all after it, but so are some government agents, and eventually our stories start to converge. And this one is a classic, and it's both written and directed by Alex Cox. It was his first feature film, although he'd go on to do a lot more, including Sid and Nancy, and a whole lot of cool music videos. Here, he was fresh out of film school at UCLA, and he teamed up with a couple of his fellow classmates to get this off of the ground. It seems that in order to get himself through college, Cox worked as an actual Repo Man, and some of the experiences in the film were based on things that had actually happened to him. They were able to get Mike Nesmith from the Monkees to sign on as an executive producer, which got them a distribution deal through Universal. The budget was only $1.5 million, and they changed the concept of the film from a road movie to only being set in Los Angeles to accommodate that. When it was released, it made a big splash and received a heaping helping of solid reviews, and is still sitting at 98% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. Universal was nervous about it though, since the film was weird and subversive, and figured that there was no way to make money off of it, but after the reviews, they beefed it up a bit, and it ended up doing okay, bringing in close to $4 million. However, it's since gone on to become a massive cult hit for its satire, soundtrack, and sensibilities. Cox planned a sequel at one point and even did some filming on it, but it was never completed. At one point, there was a documentary about the attempts to make that film called A Texas Tale of Treason, but that film appears to now be lost. However, the script for the sequel was taken and adapted into comic book form back in 2008 as Waldo's Hawaiian Holiday, which deals with Waldo adjusting to life in the 90s. Waldo being the name that Otto took after the film. There was also Repo Chick in 2009, which was also directed by Cox, made for only $200,000, mostly against a green screen. Because Cox didn't solely have the rights to Repo Man, he couldn't call it a true sequel, so it's referred to as a non-sequel, and doesn't specifically mention any characters or events from this one, although several actors return in new roles.
Yeah, let's go get sushi and not pay.
And I'll give this a 4, almost a 4.5, maybe like a 4.25. And yeah, how do you not love Repo Man? Like, it may be a little disjointed and unfocused, but It's so fun and bizarre and cool and one hell of a roster of bands. Its SFCS is a 3 since it did get pretty well known and did impact the genre a bit, but it's still a very niche film that didn't reach the wider mainstream. Should you watch it? The repo code says you have to.
On my face!
Hold him, Marlene! Freeze!
My face!
This block picks up on March 9th, and we get a look at the sillier side of 84 with Voyage of the Rock Aliens. We have a guitar-shaped spaceship cruising through the galaxy, and there's a robot on there named Robot 1359. And it's looking through different planets' cultures, and they find one with rival motorcycle gangs. And one is led by Jermaine freaking Jackson. And he's wearing this jacket, which I swear Michael ended up stealing the look of. He leads a musical number as the gangs clash, but he's kind of in love with the other's leader, played by Pia Zadora, shortly after winning the Golden Globe for Best New Star of 1982, but after winning the 83 Razzies for Worst New Star and Worst Actress. 1359 isn't interested in that planet though, although I'm not sure why, because I mean it looked pretty rad. But then he finds Earth and thinks it looks promising, so he wakes the crew by de-shrinking them, and they get their own song.
What did you think? We didn't think at all, but we had the world in the palm of our hand.
And they look like Devo, and the song has a Devo flavor, but let me tell you, it ain't Devo. They land on Earth, and Zadora is here too, as a different character, and there's some sort of tentacle creature in the lake, but I guess it's lucky that it isn't anime. The leader of the Nightbreed is here, and confidentiality prevents me from telling you my story about Craig Sheffer next to me at the hospital, but it's a pretty wild story. But forget I mentioned it. Maud is here too, and I didn't mention this earlier, but if the voice of 1359 sounds familiar, it's because it's none other than Peter Cullen, Optimus Prime himself, and he disguises himself as a fire hydrant to blend in. For some reason, this girl sees the badges on their suit that just say ABCD and like JKLM, and instead of just saying that's the alphabet, she's like, oh, your name's Absid and Jacqueline? Absid falls for Dee Dee, but she's also dating Frankie, and he's the jealous type. But then Pluto's here as well. And, oh yeah, the name of the town they're in is Spielberg. Get it? Everything is leading up to the big battle of the bands where the aliens plan to go up against the Pack, but there's also Chainsaw and the Breather. And don't forget that tentacle thing. And all of this silliness is care of James Fargo, director of Every Which Way But Loose and The Enforcer, both with Clint Eastwood, and Forced Vengeance with Chuck Norris. So he was clearly the right choice for this over-the-top musical comedy, right? It was originally meant to be a spoof of B-movies, but then was picked up and changed into a campy musical that was still sort of a spoof, I guess. And what's funny is that bit in the beginning with Jermaine Jackson was an actual music video for his duet with Pia. And that song is in the movie later on, with Sheffer doing the Jackson parts, but just lip-syncing it. But they liked the actual video and worked it into the plot. It seems like then it was basically just dumped since it wasn't given any sort of formal release and was given only a very limited run, much to the chagrin of the new wave band Rema, who played the rock aliens in the movie. They were told that the movie was meant to be a jumping off point and that the rock aliens would then have their own Saturday morning cartoon show. According to one of the band members, the decision to not give the film a wider release may have been influenced by Zadora, and says that she felt it didn't fit the image she wanted to convey. But he also said he didn't know if that was true or not, just that the film didn't get that full release. Since then, it's picked up a bunch of steam as a cult classic and campy treasure. And I'm giving this a 3.5. It's just so stupid, but in the best way possible. Like, the songs aren't good, the story's a mess, but everyone seems to be having fun, and so was I while I was watching it. The sci-fi cultural significance is just a 2 since it does have a handful of names in there and has built up a bit of status over time, but it's still mostly unseen. Should you watch it? Yes, go on this voyage.
Okay, fine.
What's the matter? Can't you get it on?
Oh, nuts!
Hey. No way to treat your tools.
Let's go back over to Italy now, and I really feel like here on the Sci-Fi Project every other film has been from Italy, but over there on March 10th there was The Final Executioner. We're set after a nuclear war, so it's likely that we're doing another Mad Max riff, and all of the people who survived are sectioned off into clean people and contaminated. If you're determined to be contaminated, you're loaded up onto these trains and shipped off into the wasteland. They send out Alan here, and he and his wife aren't contaminated, but when he speaks out against the brutality of the regime, they send him out anyway. Out there, a group of marauder-looking dudes that are hunters, and their whole shtick is that they stalk and kill the contaminated, and claim to have killed like 80 million, and whoa, that's like a lot of people. Like if they had been doing it for 20 years, they'd still have to kill over 11,000 people a day in order to do that. So they assault Alan's wife and then shoot him and lead him for dead, but he's rescued by Sam, played by classic Western actor Woody Strode. Sam is a retired cop and he helps Alan get trained up in order to fight back against the hunters and get his revenge. And this one is by Romolo Guerrieri, and he had been directing since the 60s, starting out doing a bunch of spaghetti westerns. This would end up being one of his last films though. After this, he took a 7-year break, coming back to do 2 TV movies in 91 and in 93, and then retired. And this one took a weird turn because it didn't really make any money, and the producers were pretty bummed out by that, and several years later, they tried to make up for it by taking a rather large chunk of the footage and then slapping it into a new movie in 1989 called The Bronx Executioner. They just used a bunch of scenes and redubbed them to fit their new storyline. And this one's kinda meh. It's a 2. It's just too low-key for most of the time. But there's a handful of amusing bits, but they're too few and far between. Plus, it's a post-apocalyptic movie that spends about 70% of its runtime in a regular-looking house. The SFCS is just a 1 since it's not well known at all and blends with all the other Mad Max ripoffs and just didn't make any sort of name for itself. Should you watch it? I'd say skip it, and that's final. We're staying across the ocean now and moving up to Poland for this one that arrived on May 14th, and it's called Sexmission. It's set in the far-off future of 1991, and we're at a press conference as a scientist has claimed to have mastered the science of cryonics, and plans to freeze 2 men and then wake them up 3 years later in 1994. The experiment commences, and they're then woken up and immediately notice some oddities. All of their attendants are beautiful women, and the food is different, and they're soon told that there was a massive war, and they weren't woken up and a lot more time has passed than they expected. In fact, it's 2044, 50 years later than they were planned, and yep, we're closer to that far future date right now than we are from the time that this movie was made, so go take your back pill, everyone. Seems that in those 50 years there's been a massive nuclear war, and all males have long been extinct, and the human race had been surviving through asexual reproduction. They're kept in a cell and are under constant observation and cause troubles when they eat the sacred apples. And since they're determined to be a danger in their society as men, they opt to make them into women. When they refuse, they're put on trial with the options looking to be either the surgery or being killed. Their only option becomes to escape, and then they have to hope that the outside world is any safer. And I mentioned that this one was Polish, and it's by Juliusz Marczulski, and he had gained notoriety over there very quickly for making very commercial films that also strongly satirized Polish and world politics. This was a period of a lot of unrest over there, which I discussed back in the '81 project with War of the Worlds Next Century. When this was released, it was censored before making it to the theaters, with whole section of the film being removed. But it's not solely a political satire, as it also served as a commentary on the War of the Sexes, and ended up being very controversial, but also very popular. It became Poland's highest grossing film of all time and stayed that way until 2011, and various film magazines have claimed it to be the best film to come out of the country. And it's fun, but I think you may have had to be there, so I'll give it a 3. It might be a little too entrenched in their current events for all the satire to hit, but it's still entertaining and funny, but also perhaps too long at a little over 2 hours. The SFCS is just a 1 since it's not known over here at all, and for as much of an impact as it had in its native country, it didn't make a peep over here. Should you watch it? Yeah, I think so. Like, it's a little bit Idiocracy before Idiocracy, but it's also really not. Let's head back into Fantasyland here and go all the way over to Indonesia for a film that doesn't have a known release, and it's Golok Setan, otherwise known as the Devil's Sword. It begins with a meteor falling to Earth and a man recovering some sort of mystical sword out of the ashes. We then witness a young man sacrifice himself in order to restore the Crocodile Queen, who rises up and is immediately just like in an orgy. She wants to stop the wedding of the princess of a small village because they haven't been paying the proper tribute, so she sends her warrior, Banyu Yaga, to do so, and he does it in the coolest way possible. They defy him, so he lays waste to a bunch of them in some badass ways, with the princess herself doing most of the fighting. Eventually, another warrior gets involved and matches Banyu Yaga for abilities and speed, but eventually, Crocodile Men are able to kidnap Sanjaya, and wasn't that an American Idol guy at one point? It doesn't seem to go that bad for him, really, but then that heroic dude finds out that his master has been gravely wounded by the Crocs. He has to amputate, and based on this scene alone, I feel like I should have slotted this into the horror version of the project. Turns out that Banyu Yaga also used to train with them and betrayed the master, so he sends Mandala out to retrieve the Devil's Sword and help. Also, Banyu gets busy with the Croc Queen, and she transforms into an actual crocodile in the middle of it, and it looks like the dude just keeps going. Why not, right? Along the way, there's a cool skeleton ferryman, crocodile men, this guy's head, which I can't tell if it's meant to be bald or a hat because the skin tone is different, and also the top of his head is wider than the rest of it, and lots more insanity. I mentioned that this one is from Indonesia, and it was directed by Ratno Timoer, and it was one of his earlier films, although he didn't really make that many, and they were all in his home country. It's got Barry Prima in it, and he was a big star over there, and he even got a bit of recognition over here, and his main claim to fame was playing Jaka Sembung, a character from a comic book. Based on that success, they did this one, also from a comic, one of the most popular of the time. This one was very successful over there, and even got a sequel in 1987 called Mandala from the Snake River, with Prima returning in the lead role. And I'm giving this a 3.5. It's wacky and goofy and over the top and just what I like to see. If you love Big Trouble in Little China and want to see the type of movie that it's emulating, this is one of them. The significance is just a 1 though, since it's not known over here much at all, and again, maybe more significant back in Indonesia, but just not here. Should you watch it? If you like silly action films where heads are getting cut off every 10 minutes, then absolutely.
Majesty! How come? You bitch!
This is another one that didn't have a set release date, and it's weird that it's in the same block as Voyage of the Rock Aliens, because it's Strangers in Paradise. It starts in 1939 in Berlin, as Hitler encounters a famous mesmerist who happens to look a lot like him. And then there's a full-on musical number by a cabaret band, and they say it's their final performance since the club is shutting down. Jonathan is here too, and he volunteers to be a subject for a cryogenic experiment to sleep until the war is over. And geez, it's also weird that this is in the same block as Sexmission. It's then modern times, and punk rockers are all over, disappointing their parents. There's some sort of military operation in which they're trying to brainwash the punk teens in order to make them what they call better. This leads to several musical numbers and wild outfits, and they realize their experiments don't work because the subjects go right back to their wild ways. This upsets the villains of the film, who want everyone to conform to their version of morality and want to shape sexuality and the way that people dress that they like, and hey, that sounds familiar. They read about the experiment with Jonathan, and they decide to thaw him out, making sure to do a song and dance routine while they do. He has trouble adjusting, and they get him to use his mesmerism on some subjects to cure them of their horrible, horrible gayness. And then gets a filthy, filthy rock and roller to switch to country music. But then Johnny starts to hang out with the general's daughter and realizes that, I don't know, maybe the people who are just living their lives the way they want and not trying to change others are the normal ones after all. And this one's from 80s Project regular Uli Lommel. We already featured him with The Boogeyman, Brainwaves, Olivia, Boogeyman 2, and the Devonsville Terror, so he was really cranking them out, but this is very far removed from anything else that we've seen him do. Not only did he direct, he also co-wrote the film with his wife, Susanna Love, and he stars in the film as both Jonathan and Hitler. It's clear that casting himself was a bit of a nod to his own role as a filmmaker, and Jonathan's backstory was based on Lommel's own father, as he was German, born just as the war was ending. It didn't really get much of a release, so it slipped to the wayside and has never been released outside of VHS. And I'm giving this a 3.5 as well, and I've enjoyed the past couple of Lommel flicks, which is wild because his later films are some of the worst things I've had to sit through, but this is a blast. It's silly and fun, and even if the songs aren't great, the musical numbers are a good time. The significance is just a 1.5 though, since no one knows what this is, and even Lommel fans aren't too up on it, and it only gets the 0.5 because it's part of his catalog. Should you watch it? If you watched Voyage of the Rock Aliens and were like, this should be more about the downfall of fascism, then yeah. This is weird because this next one debuted in Colombia on May 15th, but then rolled out in other countries one by one before hitting the US in December of '85, and it's She. It begins in the future, 23 years after something called the Cancellation, which I'm going to assume was a nuclear apocalypse, and there's this little trading post. However, as per the formula of sword and sorcery movies, a group of marauders then attacks, all sporting swastikas, so you know they're the bad guys, I mean, at least to some people. But then there's also this group that worship a woman called She, and it's Valeria herself, Sandal Bergman. Tom and Dick managed to survive the massacre, and their sister was captured, and her name was Harry. Get it? They go off in search of her, but end up captured by She's soldiers, and they leave Tom in the desert for dead. He's not, though, and he goes to get his brother. Meanwhile, She faces a gauntlet of enemies, including a Frankenstein robot whose head she explodes, and is given a prophecy that a man will gain her heart and destroy her. Right after, the boys manage to kidnap her and use her to escape, although they very quickly find themselves up against other nefarious forces in the wasteland with chainsaws. She comes to feel bad for them and lets them go, but both groups end up in a variety of rough situations, including glowing-eyed telekinetics, and they have to form an alliance to survive, and also take down the villainous Norks. This is yet another one that's out of Italy and dips into the whole post-apocalypse Mad Max stuff, although this one takes that and blends it with Conan for a double-sided ripoff. It was co-written and directed by Avi Nesher, and it's an earlier film for him, but he didn't do much notable outside of this film and the '93 Drew Barrymore horror flick Doppelganger. This one was based on a novel from 1887 called She, The History of Adventure by H. Rider Haggard, and was massively popular in that time frame. It had been previously adapted a number of times, in fact, including a 1965 version with Ursula Andress in the title role. This particular version is rather loosely based on the book though, as it moves things into that post-nuclear world, whereas the story is set in modern times. Well, 1887 modern times. There is no box office information available on this one, and it likely didn't have too wide of a theatrical release here, but it just never really made it that big into the public eye. Much later, in 2001, there was yet another version of She, but again, was a new take on the novel as opposed to a direct remake of this film. And this is super fun. It's a 3.5 again. This is what you call a kitchen sink movie, since it's throwing so many different things at you. Robots, vampires, mutants, everything. And it's having a blast while it does it. The SFCS is a 1.5 though, since it just never really got that well known, and even though I feel like it deserved more attention, it really didn't have it. Should you watch it? Yes, She commands it.
First of all, your evidence. You dirty rat! I'll get you for that She. You killed my brother.
We'll wrap this block up one day later, back in the US, on March 16th, and check out The Ice Pirates. We're told that water is now the most valuable thing in the entire universe, and that an evil group called the Templars control it all. But there's a band of pirates that are dedicated to fighting them. We meet our crew of swashbucklers in the middle of a raid, and one is Spencer for Hire, and another is the Manimal's best friend. But Morticia is here too, as is Hellboy. They find a sleeping princess that's probably on her way to Dallas, but they're mainly just after these big blocks of ice and use robots to help them out. But right before they're able to get away with a big haul, Jason decides to also kidnap that princess. They almost get away, but Jason and Roscoe are captured and locked away, where they meet Sloth and are taken off to be castrated. Luckily, Princess Karina rescues them, and does so in order to have them help her find her father, who has been looking for a lost seventh world which contains a massive amount of water. Look for a small role from the legendary John Carradine as the head of the Templar, and a bit of an alien parody with a small creature loose in the ship that's a space harpy. But when they find out the location of that lost planet, they all set out to live out their lives on a watery oasis. This was directed by Stuart Raffle, and his name should probably be more infamous than it is. He directed this movie, which is pretty silly fun, but then did The Philadelphia Experiment, a much more serious sci-fi flick that we'll talk about later this year, but then did Mac and Me, Mannequin on the Move, and Tammy and the T-Rex, so he's clearly a man who knows his cheese. This was originally meant to be a bigger budgeted and far more serious film with a script by Stanford Sherman, who also wrote Krull. MGM had the script in their roster where it was called The Water Planet, and they were going to give it a $20 million budget. But then the studio started having some financial troubles and had just gone through a merger and restructuring with United Artists. They slashed the bankroll to $8 million and hired Raffle to come on board and do a rewrite, making it more of a comedy. That was at the director's request, not the studio's, as he wasn't interested in doing a straightforward Star Wars style flick, and thought that embracing these sillier aspects would be the way to go. But that wasn't the ending of their troubles, since the new studio head didn't like the producer and tried to sabotage the project any way that he could, including removing the film's original ending, and it appears as if that ending is now lost. The reviews weren't great, and it's still sitting at a 17% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it didn't make too big of a dent at the box office, since it only brought in around $15 million, which was a profit, although likely not when you factor in marketing and such. It did have a really healthy life on cable, where it ran nearly non-stop for a while, and developed a decent-sized cult following over the years. And sure, it's not good, but I dig it, and so it's a 3.5, and I'd probably go 3.75 for nostalgia, but it's not a 4. It's dumb, and doesn't make much sense, but this is just so much fun that I can't help but enjoy watching it. The SFCS is a 3.5 since it did get seen on the secondary market a lot, I mean, if not the theater, but it never built up any sort of mainstream following, and no follow-ups, but it did get a bunch of cable runs and has a ton of recognizable faces in it. Should you watch it? Yes, and remember that those that hoard resources from those that need them in order to profit are the villains. This block is starting over in Japan on March 17th with a film that debuted over there under the title of Sayonara Jupiter, or I guess Bye Bye Jupiter. It's set in the 22nd century and says the Earth's population is now 18 billion and that there's 5 billion more that live in space searching for new resources. It's 2125 and they're working on bringing water to Mars by melting down the polar areas there, but when they do, they find a bunch of designs on the ground. They send a team down to investigate, stopping by the satellite that orbits Jupiter, where the pilot is Starburns. Or, I mean, it's not the guy who plays Starburns, but he might as well be. The head of the project is Dr. Honda, played by Tomokazu Miura, one of Japan's most prolific actors, and an American doctor, Millie, comes on board to meet him. And they have universal translators. And the dialogue is both in English and Japanese, depending upon who is speaking. Millie says that they believe the markings were from aliens and that they resemble similar ones found on Earth, and that they hint at some sort of key in Jupiter's red spot. Honda has to step away to give a tour of their facility, explaining that the plan is to turn Jupiter into a star in order to increase solar power. To be clear, they plan on burning up the whole planet to do so. There's protesters, including this woman with a fashionably giant hat, but she turns out to be a former love. They renew their affair, leading to space nudity, and Honda and Millie head out on this little craft down into the spot. Their ship gets massively damaged, and there's some sort of massive thing there that's making whale sounds. So, is it the Star Trek IV race? They determine that it's an alien ship, dub it Jupiter's Ghost, and it's sending a signal that they try to decipher. But then things get stickier when the captain's friend Kin are checking out an area past Pluto and are killed by an oncoming black hole. This tips them off that the hole of blackness is heading right towards our solar system and will eventually swallow our sun, an idea so sad that a hippie writes a song about it. They figure out that they can divert it by using the project to destroy Jupiter, but they still have to deal with red tape, those protesters, and Jupiter's ghost, and a shark for some reason. And this is a strange one. It's by Sakio Komatsu and Koji Hashimoto, and it was the first film for either one, but the latter would go on to direct Return of Godzilla a little later in the year. It was made in answer to Star Wars, but Komatsu, who wrote the script, wanted to make something more like 2001: A Space Odyssey. What's interesting is that you can say that it was based on a novel called Sayonara Jupiter that was released in 1982, but that itself was based on an earlier version of the script for this film, all by Komatsu himself. The reviews were only so-so, and it never got a theatrical release in the US, although it became available on the home market, although not until 2007. And I went back and forth between 3 and 3.5 on this, and I finally landed on 3.5. I liked this quite a bit, but it does sort of get dull for a while. But the cool vibe and windy storyline had me locked in. I'm surprised more people don't talk about it because it's pretty bold, and if it's knocking off 2001, it's doing it damn well. The science fiction cultural significance is just a 1 though, because it's not talked about at all, didn't get a US run, and is only known on the cult market. Should you watch it? Yeah, say Konnichiwa, Jupiter. Now let's go to one that came out on April 13th in the US, although it did have a premiere at a film festival 2 weeks earlier, but it's Iceman. But don't be looking for Bobby Drake around here. There's a group in the Arctic and they found a big chunk of ice and bring it back, and Murtaugh is here, and so is Mr. Strickland, Turk 182, Maggie Walsh, and what is this hairdo? Is Dr. Shepard here using Soul Glow? They thaw out what they found because I guess they didn't watch The Thing, but they discover that what they have is actually the body of a Neanderthal. To their surprise, as they're running their tests, they realize that they're reading brain activity, and they're able to restore his heartbeat. They start to wonder about the scientific implications, but Shepard wants them to see him as a human being and not an experiment. He starts to get comfortable in the little habitat that they built for him, and it's hard to tell, but under that makeup is the awesome John Lone. There's some struggles as he gets loose, and they have to wrangle him up and try to communicate, naming him Charlie. They continue to attempt to get through to him, introducing him to Diane. Is he saying E.T.? This crossover is weird. The problems arise when Charlie spots their helicopter and believes it to be a god bird, and that he needs to sacrifice himself to it to save his tribe, and becomes obsessed with escaping and finding it. So this was part of a really short-lived revival of caveman films in the early 80s that included Clan of the Cave Bear, Luggage of the Gods, and Quest for Fire, but infused it with the sci-fi element of bringing a Neanderthal into modern times. The director was Fred Schepisi, whose career spans a number of genres, and he did some crime flicks, a western, but then after this, he'd go on to do the classic Steve Martin film, Roxanne, and later, the Odd Fish Called Wanda pseudo-sequel, Fierce Creatures. Originally, Norman Jewison, director of Moonstruck and Rollerball, and yes, those are the 2 movies I chose to bring up, was signed to direct, but time went on and he became unavailable, although he was still on board as a producer. Seems like it wasn't a rosy working relationship though, because the script had a different ending, and Schepisi wanted something different, but the studio wanted the written one. The director went behind their backs and shot the finale that he wanted, and was let go from the project immediately afterwards. They brought him back for some post-production work though, but according to the film's composer, lost interest in the film and was seemingly sabotaging its final cut and not showing up for music sessions. It had a budget of around $10 million and only got a limited release, coming out on the same weekend as Friday the 13th, the final chapter. The reviews were pretty nice, but the box office wasn't, since it only earned back around $7 million. And I'll give this one 3 tapes. I like it, and it's well done, but it's a little dull and it feels like it's stretched out. It's a good and all, but not one I would likely rewatch. The SFCS is a 2 since it's a little more known and has a bunch of familiar faces, but it didn't make a big splash and was quickly forgotten. Should you watch it? Yeah, watch it with some amazing friends. It's time to go big again, and it won't be the only time on this block, but this is pretty freaking big because on June 1st, both the US and Canada saw the release of Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. It begins with reminding us that Spock died at the ending of the last one, and after placing his body on the Genesis planet, they're headed home. Meanwhile, though, a group of Klingons, led by Judge Doom, finds out about Genesis and wants it for his own purposes. But then, Bones starts acting weird, and Saavik starts looking weird. Well, different at least, since she's been recast, and they detect a life form down on the Genesis world. Turns out that Kirk screwed up and was supposed to bring back Spock's body, and his pops, Sarek, explains that he transferred his living spirit and it needs to be reunited with his booty and taken back home. Problems arise when it turns out that Genesis is deemed off limits by the Federation, and Bones gets himself arrested trying to get there, so Kirk and crew have to hijack the Enterprise to go. It gets more complicated when it seems like Spock has already been reborn, is rapidly aging, and needs to be reunited with his spirit. But Kruge and his men touch down to get to him first. So then, it's up to the Enterprise gang to save them and restore everyone's favorite Vulcan to his former self. So keep in mind, the film series was not firmly established at this point. The first film made money, but wasn't well loved at all. But the second film was a fan favorite, and even though it made less in ticket sales, it cost less, so the profit was higher. But after it did well, Paramount wanted more, and greenlit Part 3 immediately. They asked Nicholas Meyer, director of Wrath of Khan, to come back, but he said no, as he was upset that they altered the ending of his film without his approval. But since his experience making the second film renewed his love of the character, Leonard Nimoy was eager to come back and said he'd do it if he could direct. They moved forward with that and gave it a budget of $16 million, slightly higher than the second film, but still moderate, and they were able to use the fact that most of the sets and uniforms were still intact from the previous film to save money. The original villains of the film were going to be Romulans, but it was Nimoy that asked for them to be changed to Klingons, as he found that they were more interesting on a theatrical level. Even though it was pre-internet, they took bold measures to ensure secrecy about the storyline and prevent leaks, keeping Nimoy's name off of all of the call sheets, and simply referring to his character as Naklov, which is goblin spelled backwards. The reviews were mostly okay, but not as strong as the second film. But here's the problem. It was released in the middle of a really dense summer full of releases. It did hit number 1 in its first week of release, where it didn't have any newcomer competition, although Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was in its second week. But 1 week later, both Gremlins and another massive hit film that we'll be talking about in a second were released, pushing this one all the way down to 4th place. In the end, it pulled in $87 million worldwide, which was a drop from Wrath of Khan, but still a strong performance. It did well enough that they very quickly gave the go-ahead to a Part 4, with Nimoy returning to direct as well as co-star. And this one I'm going to give a 3.5 to. Although I've never been a Trekkie, I've always enjoyed it, but this movie just never clicked with me. I like what it's doing, and I enjoy watching it, but it feels more like a plot that they had to do in order to get Spock back, as opposed to a story they wanted to tell. The significance is a 4.5 though, because it's freaking Star Trek and everyone knows what it is. And this entry was discussed widely, but I also don't think it made as much of an impact as the previous one, nor the one after it, so it's only going to get a 4.5. For as big as frickin' Star Trek 3 was, I'm not sure if it can compare to what happened 1 week later, since on June 8th, we called the Ghostbusters for the first time. It starts off with a woman in a library saying some scary stuff, and then that opening theme song that is definitely not I Want a New Drug.
Who you gonna call?
We then meet Steve Zissou, and he's doing a psychic reading with 2 people that we've seen on the horror part of the project, with one of Arnie's bully and a girl who went up against a pair of killer Santas. One of his colleagues is Fred Garvin, male prostitute, and another is one of his old army buddies. They come face to face with the library ghost, but right afterwards, their grant at the university is terminated, so they opt to go into business to catch ghosts. They set up shop in an old firehouse, while meanwhile, Ellen Ripley encounters Seymour Krellborn and then some sort of creature in her fridge. And do you really need this, recap? Is there anyone out there who hasn't seen this? Alright, I'll keep going for both of you then. Eventually, they go out on their first job, taking on a floating green blob called Onion Head, because that's what they called it at this point, and I'll come back to him. They become overnight sensations as the number of supernatural occurrences ramp up to the point that they need to bring on another member, Sergeant Albrecht. But it seems like this increase in spiritual activity is linked to the things going on in Dana's apartment building. And somehow ghost blowjobs are also involved. Ghostbusters. This movie's really Dan Aykroyd's baby, because that man is obsessed with ghosts. And by that I mean having sex with them. Hence the blowjob scene. Originally, it was meant to star Aykroyd and his SNL buddy John Belushi, along with Eddie Murphy. But when Belushi died of an overdose, he instead discussed it with Murray, and while shooting Trading Places, Dan also pitched the concept to Murphy, but he turned it down flat, calling it a crock. But that may be disputed, since later the comic said that he was supposed to be in Ghostbusters, but wasn't able to because he was tied up with Beverly Hills Cop. To be clear though, Murphy wasn't meant to be Winston. He was the Venkman character in the original concept, and Murray wasn't brought in until after he declined. Ivan Reitman was hired to direct based on the strength of Animal House and his previous work with Murray on Stripes. The original script was far more serious and was a lot bolder, taking place in the future, and Reitman felt that it was impossible to shoot on a decent budget, and it was his suggestion to make it more of a blue-collar comedy. And he also suggested bringing in Ramis. It was given around $30 million to work with, and filming was pretty hectic and featured some guerrilla-style filmmaking to get things done under budget. Apparently, after screening the film for a bunch of the crew's industry friends and studio execs, everyone feared the worst and thought the film was going to be a gigantic money loser. Plus, it was coming out during a crowded summer and was going up against another big player, Gremlins, in its debut weekend as well. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, Temple of the Doom was still fresh in theaters, as was Star Trek III, so the choices were many. The reviews were strong, and the marketing push included that theme song, which would debut as a #1 hit song, and the movie hit #1 in the opening weekend. It stayed in that top spot for 7 weeks, dropping down to #2 for 1 week, but then bounced back to #1 for another week and earned over $225 million worldwide in its initial run. It became a massive sensation and spun off a ton of merchandising, including a popular animated TV show called The Real Ghostbusters, a title that they had to go with to avoid a lawsuit from a classic TV show called The Ghostbusters, 2 words, from the 70s. That cartoon renamed Onion Head, a name never used on screen, to Slimer, and he became a sensation with kids everywhere. A sequel followed, but not until 1989, and it wasn't nearly as well loved nor as profitable, so the series went into stasis for a long time, partially due to the death of Harold Ramis. There was also an attempt at a reboot in 2016, a movie that is pretty infamous by being hated by a bunch of chuds for the wrong reasons, but also being generally disliked for the right reasons as well. In 2021, Ghostbusters Afterlife came out, reuniting the original cast, along with a new younger crew, and that storyline, and like 13 other ones, were continued in 2024's Frozen Empire. And yep, I love Ghostbusters. It's a 4.5 from me. I can't give it the perfect 5 because I still think the plot is a little too scattered and then suddenly just sort of jumps to the ending. But the comedy all works, well, I mean, except for that blowjob bit. And the performances are fantastic. The effects are varied and fun. It's just a blast. Plus, I love that it's a comedy first, with these other elements happening in the background, as opposed to the later films, which are Ghostbusters movies first, and comedies as an afterthought. The SFCS is definitely a 5, though. It was a massive hit, spawned a major franchise, impacted the genre massively, and it's just, I don't know, man, it's just Ghostbusters. Should you watch it? I mean, you already have, but do it again, and show them how they do things downtown.
There is no day now, only soul.
What a lovely singing voice you must have.
Well, let's scale things down now. Way down, because on June 22nd in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was the premiere of a film that would get a wider release in February of 1985, and it's The Lost Empire. It begins in a jewelry store, and 3 ninja are like bulletproof fellas with seemingly magic ninja stars, which kill the owner and steal stones out of this statue's head. The police interfere, though, and everyone but one cop ends up dead. A text screen tells us about the Lemurians, a mystical race that put all of their powers into the eyes of Avatar, those stones from the beginning. And it's said that whoever brings them together will hold ultimate power. We then have a hostage situation that's broken up by Inspector Wolf, and it turns out that cop from the intro is her brother, and she goes to see him in this outfit, and he gives her the star. Wolf's boyfriend uses the power of his mustache and hairdo to identify it as the sign of Lee Chuck, a man who's immortal, but in order to stay that way, has to kill 1 person a day to deliver his soul to the devil. She goes for help, which turns out to be a magical native woman wearing a skimpy outfit because why not? But she needs more assistance and goes to a women's prison, where this is apparently the standard uniform. And then there's Whiplash here, who seems to wear this underneath her prison outfit, and is also allowed to have a damn whip with her, and I guess that's cool with the guards. And oh, there's a mud puddle right there. I'm assuming. Yep, that was inevitable. After recruiting their third, they join up with some religious cult to go to the island of Golgotha to be part of their tournament, but have to go through tests, deal with robot spiders, and duels. But when they do come face to face with Sindo, his voice may sound extremely familiar. And yep, he's a pretty tall man. And with this much cleavage on display, this can only be from Jim Wynorski, and he wrote and directed as well as produced this one. This was actually his first directing gig, and he had previously been working with Roger Corman, doing mostly writing. Corman wasn't involved in this one though, as the money came from a guy named Henry Plitt, who was a theater owner, and his plan was to make the film as a money loser to use as a tax loss and write-off. But Wynorski was not aware of this and put a strong effort into it. So when Plitt saw the finished product, he liked it and opted to instead give it a theatrical release, and it ended up being profitable. This was a problem though, because Plitt had the rights, and when the theaters changed hands, the legality of it was up in the air, and Wynorski was unclear of who had the means to release it, if anyone, and it took him over 2 decades to find out in order to help oversee a new edition being distributed. And this is a 3. It's pretty fun. Like, sure, it's just a rehash of Enter the Dragon, but with lots of boobs, but it's entertaining, and yeah, lots of boobs. The SFCS is just a 1.5 though, since it was lost for a while and didn't get much recognition at the time, but it did kick off Wynorski's career, so it gets a little boost. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, it's not great, but this empire does not deserve being lost.
Will you do the honors? Bring this intruder to the brink of death, then save the coup de grace for me.
This juggernaut summer kept on rolling with another big release on June 29th, and we're going back to the days of high adventure with Conan the Destroyer. Our big boy is back, and the Governator returns to the role, and he has a new companion in Bob the Goon, who we just saw a little bit ago in Repo Man. They're ambushed by a group of men, and it turns out to be a queen who's also a Kryptonian, and she wants to hire him. If he goes on a quest for her, she promises to resurrect his dead love, Valeria, and he agrees. They actually bring back the camel that he punched in the first film so that he can hit it again. And like he remembers the camel, like he was able to look at this camel and recognize it as a camel that he had seen previously based on its looks. The quest is to escort the Queen's niece to retrieve a key that will allow them to restore a magic horn, and she turns out to be Kevin's older sister, while her guardian is a stilt. But their plan is to betray Conan. They head out with Conan asking Akira to help him again, with Mako returning to the role, but also recruit Mayday, in Grace Jones's first bigger role. Trouble arises when the princess is kidnapped by the evil Thothamon and have to go into his fortress to rescue her, going up against mirror monsters, marauders, high priests, and more in order to complete their task. Although when they finally do, perhaps they shouldn't have. So, the original Conan film was a massive hit, so a sequel was inevitable, but John Milius wasn't available to handle it. Because of this, Dino De Laurentiis brought in Richard Fleischer, fresh off of directing Amityville 3D. The first film was rated R, and Universal thought that it would have made even more money if it was available to a wider audience, so they asked for them to create a PG-rated, more mainstream feature. The finished product did get that PG, although it likely would have ended up with a PG-13 had it been released a few months later after that rating was created. It looks like they still shot some scenes that would have gotten it an R though, and a number of sequences had to be cut out to secure the PG. Arnold was against the toning down of the film and thought that the script was too childish. He preferred the darker and more adult-oriented original, and making this movie made him lose interest in doing any more Conan films. The budget was slightly less than the first film, at $18 million, and the reviews were mixed, with some calling it a more entertaining venture than the first, but others complained about the campier tone. It didn't do nearly as well as the original, making only $31 million at the box office, which made it profitable, but only slightly so. They did intend to do a third film in '87 called Conan the Conqueror, but since Arnold wasn't psyched about coming back and was committed to other things, it was never made. But the script was retooled into 1997's Krull the Conqueror instead. The character was rebooted in 2011 with Jason Momoa, but it was a flop, so it never launched a new franchise. Right after that, there were plans to bring Schwarzenegger back after that to do a new film, like a direct sequel to the original that ignored this one, but it never happened, even if they were still discussing it in 2019. Oh yeah, and in the end, when Conan is fighting a giant demon beast, that's an uncredited Andre the Giant in that suit. And this is a 3. It's fun and all, but it's lacking everything that made the first one great, and it feels more like a Conan knockoff than Conan himself. Like, I know I prefer the darker tone, but there's still enough good in here for an enjoyable time. The SFCS is a 2.5 since it's part of a well-known property, with one of Sci-Fi's biggest stars in more ways than one, and several other known faces, but it just wasn't seen as much and didn't leave nearly as big of a dent. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's not great, but it's certainly worth a watch. Man, the hits just keep on coming with this year, since a few short weeks later, on July 13th, we had another classic release with The Last Starfighter. It begins in this quiet little mountain community, and for those that think that LA is like this big urban hellhole, this little area is a mere 45-minute drive from the city, and you have to drive through about 20 minutes of mountains to get here. We meet Michael Brody 4.0, and we last saw his girlfriend singing in the Apple back in '80, and Alex has big dreams, even if he's stuck helping out as his trailer park's handyman. He's also obsessed with playing this video game called Starfighter, and one night he breaks its record and gets to the kill screen. Unfortunately, he's denied his loan to go to college, and things are rocky with Maggie, but just a little later, a strange car shows up. The driver is a music man, and he asks Alex to get into his car, and he does. Just gets into a stranger's car in the middle of the night, in the middle of the mountains. It's a good thing that this is the sci-fi project and not the horror one. His name is Centauri, and he says that he has an offer for him, and the car straight up launches into space. He takes him to a whole ass other planet called Rylos, where he's given a suit and told that the video game was actually a recruitment tool to find the best fighters in the universe to take on the evil Kodan Empire. He also meets an alien named Grig, and he's pretty jovial and silly. And would you believe that under this makeup is Connell Cochran, like the old man from RoboCop? Alex decides that the stakes are too high for him though and asks to be taken back to Earth. But things get way tougher when he finds that a cloned duplicate had been taking his place there. And the Kodans destroyed the entire Starfleet, leaving Alex a target as the last Starfighter left alive. So he finally agrees to go back, teaming up with Grig in a Gunstar ship and taking on the entire enemy fleet single-handedly. This one was the product of Universal and was cashing in on the popularity of Star Wars and the huge rise of video games. The director was the OG Michael Myers himself, Nick Castle, fresh off of his directorial debut of Tag, the assassination game. When he was helping out John Carpenter do the post-production work on Halloween 2, he was impressed with Lance Guest and then sought him out for the lead here. The budget was moderate at $15 million and was one of the first films to feature a good amount of computer-generated graphics with the space scenes, as opposed to models. When they screened it for test audiences, the reaction was positive, but they showed a huge reaction to the scenes that featured the beta unit back on Earth, so Castle opted to go back in and shoot some additional moments there. However, since Guest had already chopped off all of his hair and he got really sick during the shoot, they had to put him in a wig and a ton of makeup. The reviews weren't glowing, but they were positive, but it just didn't get a huge reaction in the theaters. It brought in just under $30 million, which was a nice profit, but not as big of a success as some of the others released this same summer. But then it was a nice success on the aftermarket, getting a strong cable run and developed a cult following. Much later, there were attempts to make a sequel, but it didn't move past scripting stage for years. After a while, though, when it seemed like interest was heating up, Jonathan Butel, the film's writer and holder of the rights, declared that he didn't want a follow-up made. Those rights were up in the air, though, and it seems as if Butel had the rights for a sequel, but Universal had the rights to do a remake, but Warner Brothers had some distribution rights, so there's a good amount of red tape to go through for any follow-ups. Nothing's really come to fruition, but as recent as 2021, there's been talks and efforts to get it back into reality. And I like this, but it's flawed, but I'll still give it a 3.5. I really enjoy it, but I've always found it to be a little too simplistic, and the whole ending battle is just way too easy and anticlimactic. The significance is a 3, since it's pretty well known, but it never became a massive hit, didn't alter the genre at all, and in terms of merchandise and spin-offs and all that, it just never stuck. Should you watch it? Yep, you've been recruited by the Star League to watch this film and save the universe.
What do we do? We die.
So this has been a powerhouse of a block, but I'm ending it with one that I know will stir things up, because on July 20th, 1 week later, there was the release of Electric Dreams. We meet a resident of Twin Peaks, and he's an architect and is extremely disorganized. So one of his co-workers recommends getting a home computer to get things straight. He goes out to get one of the latest models, setting it up, and look at this thing. I'm betting this has like a whopping 256K of RAM. It thinks his name is Moles, and he gives it control over his electrical appliances. There's a new neighbor moving in, and he might tell her to be his victim. But she's just moved there to be a part of the symphony, where she encounters a cool rider. Meanwhile, Miles is trying to develop an earthquake-proof brick and hacks into his company's computer to do so, which overloads it, and he compounds the issue by pouring champagne all over it. It's not destroyed though, and the next day turns itself on and plays a song with Madeline through the vents. She thinks that Moles was responsible and they go on a date, but he keeps having to hide the fact that he knows nothing about computers. But then things change again when it turns out that the computer can talk and has been given a form of life. He starts chatting it up, and if his voice is familiar, it's because it's Harold himself, Bud Cort. The computer is also in love with Madeline and wants her to know that the music is by him, and they start a little love triangle and a rivalry that leads to giant Pac-Man. So this one is directed by Steve Barron, and this guy is one of the biggest music video directors in the industry, or what used to be the music video industry, considering it's sadly becoming a dead art. He had already done videos like Toto's Africa, Thomas Dolby's She Blinded Me with Science, Madonna's Burning Up, and Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, but this was his first feature film. After this, he would only direct periodically and is responsible for both the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie and the Coneheads movie. The budget was pretty meager at a little over $5 million, and the shoot was said to be so easy that Virginia Madsen called it her favorite filming experience. The film is really music heavy and contains a lot of what are sort of music videos throughout, and that was partly because the studio wanted something to cash in on Flashdance success, but also tagged into Barron's previous experience. But then the reviews weren't great, and the movie was a failure, only bringing in around $2.5 million. Thankfully, it got a good amount of cable play and earned itself a strong cult following, and Madsen herself ended up buying the rights and tried to get a remake made, but no studios were interested. And I'm a sucker for this movie, so this may be controversial, but I give it a 4. I've just seen this so many damn times, and I enjoy it so much. Cort is just charming as hell as Edgar. Madsen and Von Dolan really seem to be having a good time together, which they apparently really were. The significance is just a 1.5 though, since it never caught on, was a flop, and only generated a small amount of attention. But it did get some recognition and a good amount of known talent behind it. Should you watch it? Yes, because we'll always be together. Together in electric dreams.
Darling, I love you to bits, and I want to see your tits.
This block kicks off big with a film that was released on July 20th, even though it did premiere a little earlier in West Germany on April 6th, but it's the NeverEnding Story. We're introduced to little Bastian, and he's played by Barrett Oliver, who we just saw over on the horror project in Invitation to Hell. His dad is one of the Simons, although I don't know which Simon, but I know he's the opposite Simon to the one that I made this same joke about in my recap of White Dog. Seems Bastian's having trouble in school and he's picked on by bullies, so he hides out in an old bookstore run by a crotchety old man named Carl Conrad Coriander, and he tells Basti about a dangerous book called The NeverEnding Story, and he steals it. Although it appears as if that was the plan all along. Since he gets to school late and doesn't want to be tardy, he sneaks up into the attic to read. And the story is set on a world called Fantasia, where Deep Roy lives, as well as this massive rock creature. He tells the tale that their lands are being destroyed by a massive force called the Nothing, that deletes everything in its wake. They go to see the Empress, but she's suffering from a mysterious illness, so they call in Atreyu, otherwise known as Harry Potter Jr. And this right here is the great Moses Gunn, who we just saw in Firestarter and Amityville 2 on the Horror Project. Atreyu heads out on the journey with his horse Artex, and look, I don't want to think about it yet. Give me a second because I know that it's coming. Okay, so here we go. Their journey takes them through this swamp of sadness, and you know what? I'm just gonna skip over this part. If you don't know what happens, well, go experience that trauma for yourself. But then things get weird when it seems like the book characters can actually hear Bastion, and he stays late to finish it in the middle of a storm. But the story changes when Atreyu meets Falkor, the luck dragon, and I have to tell you, something about the scales on Falkor's back make me feel really uncomfortable. Together, the two of them have to go on a quest, because let's face it, having a luck dragon with you is the only way to go on a quest. But how on earth, or I guess Fantasia, do you stop nothing? So this was another big deal of a film, and it was directed by Wolfgang Petersen, and this was the film he made right after getting a bunch of Oscar noms for Das Boot. It was based on a book of the same name by Michael Ende, and he was initially involved with the adaptation and served as a script supervisor, but then later said that Petersen did a rewrite without any consultation, and that it now was so different than the book that he wanted to either halt production or change the title, but the studio said no to both. Ende sued them over it, but lost the case, and he went on to trash the finished product. It had a pretty strong budget of around $25 million and went on to garner a good amount of strong reviews. The box office is interesting though, because it was not a big hit in the US. It debuted at number 4 in the opening weekend, coming in behind Ghostbusters and Gremlins in their 7th week of release, and the comedy Best Defense in its debut week. It only brought in $20 million total in the US market, but did far better internationally, earning over $100 million, with a large chunk of that being in Petersen's home country of Germany. It would then become a much bigger deal on the home market and getting a whole lot of airplay on cable. Since the movie only adapted the first half of the book, the second half was then used to make a sequel, although not until 1990, and a third entry would come out in 94, with that one not based on one of the books. But then there would be a number of musical continuations of the film, with 2002's Suicide Notes and Butterfly Kisses, 2004's The Curse, and then, oh, wait, that's the Atreyu spin-off series. And yeah, I love this. It's a 4. This actually feels like a classic fairy tale, and I still think that the effects are great. Well, I mean, except for Gamort's mouth movements. It might be nostalgia talking, but I think it's well paced, has great character stuff, and a touching finale. The sci-fi cultural significance is a 4 as well, since it was pretty widely known and has become an established name, even if it didn't really take off like some of the other big films of this same era. Should you watch it? Yep, just maybe fast forward the Swamp of Sadness bit. We're now up to August 3rd here as we move through this year, and the next one is another with a very recognizable name, with The Philadelphia Experiment. A text crawl tells us about experiments in 1943 to make ships' radar invisible, and that's where the opening is set. And there's several sailors here, including Michael Paré, before he'd be in just whatever low-budget horror flick threw him some money. They're stationed on a ship called the USS Eldridge, which is docked in Philadelphia, and they run their experiment. And the ship becomes invisible to the radar, but then something goes wrong, and it starts to glow, and Jim and David have to jump off the ship to get away. They fall into a wormhole-looking thing and end up in a desert while a helicopter hovers above them. The boys run away and believe that they've been hypnotized, seeing unfamiliar things. But at a nearby military base, Ned Ryerson, Bing, is hanging out. and they say that an entire town has just vanished. Eventually, Jim and David find a diner and see video games, humanoids from the deep on TV, and also Officer Ann Lewis. After a misunderstanding, they have to steal Allison's car, and she has to go with them, and she tells them that it's 1984. This guy is also here, and he's a doctor, but I mostly know this guy as the old teacher from the Porky's film, and he's starting to put it all together. But so are the boys as they figure out that they're in the future. But they're also plagued by these constant bolts of lightning, eventually disintegrating Jim. But when there's also a gaping hole in the sky creating some sort of vortex, David had damn well figured out if he can fix things and get back home, if he even wants to. So this one was directed by Stuart Raffel, and we literally just saw him earlier this year with Ice Pirates. It was based on an urban legend from the 40s about a ship, also called the Eldridge, that is said to have had some bizarre circumstances after a similar type of experiment as the one in the film. At one point, John Carpenter was attached to this to write and direct, and he took a shot at writing a script, but wasn't happy with it, and turned it into a sort of a horror story that he felt was too similar to The Fog, and he ended up not doing it in the end, although he's still listed as an executive producer. It had a modest budget of $9 million, and the Navy wanted nothing to do with it and did not give their approval. Critics weren't too hot on it either, although the reviews weren't terrible, but it turned out to be a bomb. In its opening weekend, it debuted in 10th place behind the teen sex comedy The Joy of Sex. It only earned $8 million in its entire run and was rushed to the home market. At the time, it was the fastest ever turnaround time for a film to get a video release after playing in the theaters. It did end up having a cult following on cable though, and gained enough cred to have a sequel made in 1993. That was called The Philadelphia Experiment 2, and a number of characters returned, although every one of them were recast. And it's an entirely different director and writer. There was also a remake, a made-for-TV movie in 2012, also called The Philadelphia Experiment. Michael Paré did return for this one, but playing a new character that was created just for this version. And it's a 2.5. It's fine, but not really my thing. Like, the time travel stuff is the most interesting part, but they never get into those aspects in a unique way and spend too much time on some uninspired chase scenes. Its significance is the same since it's somewhat well known, although not all that widely seen, and didn't impact the genre at all. It did have some impact though, and has enough names involved to get a little extra. Should you watch it? Probably. Like I know some people who like this one way more than me, so perhaps it's just one that I didn't click with. Strap in for this next one because it's gonna take a while to explain, but on August 10th, in limited release, the world was introduced to the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai across the 8th dimension. The text crawl tells us all about Buckaroo and that he has an American mom and a Japanese dad, and he's a neurosurgeon, a particle physicist, a martial arts master, a rock and roll star, and the creator of a jet car. And also, aliens are keeping an eye on him. And that's like a lot for just 3 paragraphs. Banzai is due to be at the launch of his new jet car experiment, but he's running late because he's busy doing an operation with Seth Brundle. Sergeant Zim is here, as is the Heavenly Kid, although he's much blonder here, and Buckaroo then commences the actual jet car experiment, which is the act of driving it directly into a mountain, which puts him into this psychedelic fever dream, and then he pops out the other side. On the way though, it seems like he picked up a hitchhiker, and TV coverage is watched by Dick Solomon, and it seems like 30 years ago he tried the same experiment with less successful results, and it drove him mad. He's in an insane asylum, and his caretaker is Mike.
Laugh a while you can, monkey boy.
But don't get too comfortable with that plot setup, because now we need a musical number from the Hong Kong Cavaliers, rock and roll scientists, and doctors. And Buckaroo is so at one with the vibes of the audience that he's able to sense a single audience member who is having a bad time and crying, and it's Ellen Barkin. And when the crowd gives her a hard time, he says the thing.
Don't be mean. We don't have to be mean. Because, remember, no matter where you go, there you are.
And can we all just, like, remember that? Just like have that in the back of your mind. Penny tries to kill herself, but everyone thinks that she's trying to kill Buckaroo, but she looks exactly like his dead ex. And then Lizardo escapes. And, like, I've already talked about this one more than most films, and it's not even a third of the way done. And we haven't even gotten to the main plot points yet. New Jersey joins their crew, and we see those aliens keeping an eye on them in space and on Earth, and their Cher's dad, and the subway ghost, but also Reverend Jim. And here's the thing, I can literally spend the whole runtime of this video just talking about all the stuff that happens in this movie. Every 5 minutes is giving you new weirdness, new characters, new plot lines, new concepts, just the kitchen sink. It started with the writer Earl Mac Rauch, who wrote the script as a tribute to the crazy kung fu movies of the 70s and wrote a number of drafts, and at one point had a giant robot in it, and another with space lepers. W.D. Richter, who is mostly known as a writer and had previously written the 78 Invasion of the Body Snatchers and the Frank Langella Dracula, wanted to direct and liked Rauch's concept, and they ended up at 20th Century Fox, who gave it a $12 million budget. With as much stuff as is jammed into this movie, there was actually quite a bit more that was cut out, including a number of references to a villain named Hanoi Zan, Banzai's nemesis and the leader of the World Crime League, and I'll mention that again in a bit. Another moment that was cut out was the inclusion of Buckaroo's mom, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, although you can still see a photo of her in the jet car. They intended to release it in the summer and have it come out in June, but didn't want it to go up against Star Trek, Indiana Jones, and Ghostbusters, so they bumped it to August, but that gambit didn't pay off. In its opening weekend, it was in limited release and only played 236 screens, but only pulled in $620K. It only earned $6 million in its whole run and was dubbed a failure. The ending credits promised a sequel called Buckaroo Banzai vs. the World Crime League, and they did intend to make that film, but after its failure, they scrapped it. However, on the home market, over time, it's developed a sizable and fervent cult following. A novelization was released of the film, and much later, the world did get a look at Banzai fighting that crime league in novel form. There's also been several comics, with Marvel doing an adaptation when the film came out, and Moonstone releasing new adventures in 2006. At one point in '98, there were plans to make a Fox TV series called Buckaroo Banzai, Ancient Secrets and New Mysteries, but it never made it past the test footage stage. Kevin Smith was also attached to a different series in 2016, but that also never happened due to rights lawsuits and the fact that no one wanted to see Kevin Smith do a Buckaroo Banzai series. Or was that just me? I did not want to see that. At all. And I really love this one. It's a 4.5, and I have a feeling your rating will not be as high. People are pretty split on this one because it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it isn't really a story as much as a strange collection of events, but I dig it more than I ever thought I would. The SFCS is just a 3 though, because it may have a cult following, but it's still a cult following, and didn't impact the genre at the time at all. Plus, it didn't really establish itself as any sort of cultural phenomenon or franchise, and the mainstream market still hasn't widely seen it. Should you watch it? Yep, Perfect Tommy would, so should you.
Why is there a watermelon there?
I'll tell you later.
This next one is pretty interesting because it's a new version of an old movie in a way that we haven't covered before. And on August 10th, in limited release, we had Giorgio Moroder's Metropolis. This opens by telling us that in 2026 there would be oppression and manipulation of the masses by the unquestionable power of the few, and most people are forced to work themselves to the bone. 2026, huh? Sounds about right. And we see the workers shuffle off for the day, but up above the city, the wealthy while away the day, and we meet young Freighter, one of the city's richest men's sons. Freighter becomes fascinated with a woman named Maria, who brings children up to the top to see how the wealthy live, so he goes down below to find her. There, he sees the horrible conditions that the workers deal with and feels empathy, and decides to fight to make things better for them. And that right there is the least believable thing on this entire block. Like, I know that this is all science fiction, but let's not get too fantastical, right? So, by now, you've noticed that this is a silent film, and if you don't recognize it, it's Metropolis from 1927. And I'll make this a little quick. In '84, Giorgio Moroder, composer responsible for a number of dreamy soundtracks, got the rights for around $200,000 and wanted to oversee a new version of it. Originally, he only intended to make a new soundtrack for it, but when he discovered that there was no longer a true original print, he set out to do a full restoration. They colorized it, not like a full colorization, but scenes were given certain tints to accentuate them, and tweaks were made, including taking away the intertitles and adding subtitles instead, and some mild special effects. Because of the intertitle removals, this version runs nearly an hour shorter than the regular version, although part of that is because some of the scenes were still missing. At this point, it was the most complete version of the film out there, although some portions thought to be lost were discovered after this, making for a more true experience. An entirely new score was given to the picture, and it had contributions from Freddie Mercury, Adam Ant, Pat Benatar, and Bonnie Tyler. When it was released, critics tore it apart as blasphemy, and that he tampered with the original too much, and was even nominated for a couple of Golden Raspberries. And one of them was for Freddie Mercury's song, which is more evidence that the Razzies just should not exist. It did, however, make money, but then had some troubles with getting a home release due to rights issues with the music, and was unavailable for quite a while. That's all been resolved, though, and it can now be seen on Blu-ray, and after all the controversy died, it can be appreciated as a different way to view the film. And I'll go 3.5 on it. It's hard to rate this because, like, most of the high score is for the original film itself, and I'd rather watch it in its unaltered state, but this isn't a bad way to check it out, even if I think some of the music doesn't quite work. The significance is just a 2, though, because it was a small success, but nearly all of the relevance here is due to the original film, and not this particular version. So this, on its own, doesn't really deserve much in the way of points. Should you watch it? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a great flick, and if you don't like silent films, it's an interesting way to watch it. And if you do enjoy them, it's actually a solid soundtrack, so it's worth watching just to hear. I guess I'm including this next one as sort of a superhero entry, maybe fantasy, but on August 17th there was the release of Sheena. This begins with a pack of geologists investigating an area said to have dirt with healing properties, and they have a little girl with them. While doing research in a cave, they cause it to collapse, and they're both killed, while little Janet escapes. She's taken in by the tribal shaman and renamed Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, and is seen as part of an ancient prophecy that they believe in. Time passes and she learns how to communicate with animals and eventually reaches adulthood and looks like an angel. So, the tribe that she lives with are the Tigora, and the king's brother is an ex-football player, and he's working with outsiders to try to plunder the land for resources. But the shaman has a vision about it and goes to warn him. There's a couple of reporters coming in to do a story about Adwani, and one will probably sell his soul to the devil, and the other would sell his sister to Bluto. So it seems like the king's fiancé is having a fling with his bro, and they're doing that plotting. And at night, at a big party, Jabulani is killed, and the shaman is framed for it. Vic thinks something is fishy and soon comes face to face with Sheena, and they pair up to figure out what happened. But the Countess has a squad of mercenaries on her payroll to try to take them out. Along the way, Vic and Sheena bond, and she learns about the ways of men and the meaning of love. And I should mention that this film is only rated PG, and yet if you want a scene in which Tanya Roberts is swimming completely naked, you definitely get it here. And this was another adaptation of a classic comic book character. Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, was published back in 1938 and began in random magazines, but got her own title in 1941 and was the first female character to have her own book, beating Wonder Woman to the stands by a couple of months. The first attempt to make a film of it was back in the 70s with Raquel Welch as the title character, but that one never came to fruition. It bounced around for a while and was almost made in 80 with Bo Derek, but it finally landed at Columbia, with John Gillerman was hired to direct. He was very established in the industry and is the man responsible for the 76 King Kong remake, but I guess in terms of this picture, had made several earlier Tarzan movies. The budget was a steep $25 million. The shoot was very difficult, mainly due to the amount of animals involved. But then when it was released, it was a huge bomb, only earning around $6 million, the same amount of money that Buckaroo Banzai made, although that one only cost $12 million and played in around 10 times less theaters. It was also massively panned, and was also nominated for a bunch of Razzies, although much like the other films discussed here, did manage to get a nice cult following on the home market. Oh, and there was also a comic book adaptation from Marvel, because a ton of films had Marvel Comics adaptations, apparently, and in much later years, Devil's Due would bring the character back for new adventures. And this is decent enough for a 2.5. It's mostly kind of standard stuff, and I wish they played up Sheena's abilities more to make her not just like a standard Tarzan clone. Also, at just under 2 hours, this one is way too long. The SFCS is a 2 since it's kinda known but not really seen, and did get some cable play, but no one really talks about it all that much, and it certainly didn't have an impact on the genre. Should you watch it? It's worth a look since there is fun here, but it's not enough for this runtime. Get ready for a weird one now, because on August 29th in Seattle, there was a run for a little film called Nothing Lasts Forever. It's in black and white and has Billy Peltzer as a concert pianist, but it's all a scam. He's Milli Vanilliing it, and the audience finds out, rushing the stage and attacking him. But it's all a nightmare he's having on a train ride. He decides to go back to America to follow his dreams of being an artist, but after a disaster, New York is now controlled by the Port Authority. He has some trouble getting in, but stays with his aunt and uncle, and then has to take some sort of art test to discover if he's considered valuable to the city. He fails and is given a crappy job under Beldar Conehead, where he has to just watch traffic as it comes into the city and look out for any cars that need work. Adam decides to move out and get his own apartment and starts hanging out with the art crowd, and they start a fling, but he just can't seem to find his art of choice. But then things take a turn when a homeless man that he helped out comes to get him and takes him underground, where the film switches to color, and he finds out about a secret society that's running the world from down there, and they want to send him to the moon on an important mission, and he'll meet his soulmate there. In order to get there, he has to take a bus driven by Steve Zissou, and they take off, flying to the moon to commence his mission and maybe meet up with some moon maidens. And you may be saying to yourself, again, what the hell is this? This is more confusing than Buckaroo Banzai, and you may be right. And the story on this one is pretty weird. It was written and directed by Tom Schiller, and he was one of the original writers for Saturday Night Live, and even appeared on screen for one season. His main claim to fame on the show was the short films that he did, including the famous Don't Look Back in Anger, where John Belushi danced on the fellow cast members' graves. This was to be his theatrical directorial debut, and MGM gave him a budget of around $3 million to work with in 1982. Since the cast and crew were mostly members of SNL and included a number of known comic entities, they left the production alone, figuring that they were getting a silly comic film. However, when they viewed the final cut, they were shocked to see that it was a surreal art film. They freaked out and pulled the film from its release date and put it up on a shelf. 2 years later, when Ghostbusters was a huge hit and Zach Galligan scored big in Gremlins, they thought that they could release it and gave it that run in Seattle for 2 weeks. But when the reviews weren't great and ticket sales were slow, they decided against a bigger rollout and put it back on that shelf. And that's where it sat, and still sits, as the movie has never been given any sort of official release. Over the years, it's had a handful of screenings, several attended by Bill Murray. In 2011, someone leaked it to YouTube, although only for a limited time when it was yanked for copyright violation. It also had limited airings on Turner Movie Classics back in 2015, so it has been seen, but not in any major way, and to this day, still has no physical release. And what an odd film. I'll give it a 3. I like the vibe it's giving me, and I find it fascinating, but it's not quite funny enough to be a comedy, and not quite impactful enough to be a dramatic, but I still enjoy it quite a bit. The SFCS is a 2, and it's tricky because it's not had an impression on the film world since it never got out there, but it's chock full of named stars and had a reputation for years as a hidden treasure, so the extra notoriety comes from there. Should you watch it? Definitely. This is worth a watch and a good head scratch. Our next one has a slightly unknown date, but it was released at some time in September, and it's called Hyperspace. It begins with a recreation of the Star Wars crawl as we learned about an evil galactic alliance and a rebellion led by Princess Sheena, but the villain's navigational error took them off course. And then we're on Earth, with a couple of fishermen doing some dynamite fishing, and a spaceship soars in and sets down. A couple of kids encounter one of the ship's inhabitants, a Jawa-looking critter, and the family calls in an exterminator to take care of it. It almost kills him, but he's also a student, and it looks like we have a wannabe Vader on hand with this guy, Lord Buckethead, not to be confused with the regular Buckethead, as he lacks a guitar. LB is looking for the princess and important plans, and winds up going into the little town looking for transmissions, but finding the auto kind, not the radio kind. He mistakes this lady for Sheena, and you may not recognize her here, but this is young Paula Poundstone. Max shows up, and him and Karen escape with a shop vac that they think is a droid containing the secret transmissions. The authorities get involved, including a cabin boy, but our duo is eventually captured. The little minion guys keep on trying to tell Bucko that they have the wrong planet and the wrong people, but he doesn't listen and just kills them. Soon, though, the military get involved, but it's mainly up to Max and Karen to get loose and save the day and maybe the universe. This one is obviously meant to be a parody of Star Wars and was written and directed by Todd Durham, and we've already talked about him this year over on the horror version of the product. He did one of the segments in the film Tales of the Third Dimension, and then directed this, but it would be his final work in the chair. After this, he'd mainly just write, and frequently did work uncredited as a script doctor. Eventually, in 2012, one of his ideas was sold and then turned into Hotel Transylvania. Originally, it was done in 3D and was part of a package of films produced by Owensby Studios, and this is where things get really, really weird. MGM was meant to release it in the US, but then just didn't, and it only got a wider release in the UK under the title Gremloids. It wasn't all that big of a hit there, but then later, in 1987, a man named Mike Lee dressed up as Lord Buckethead and participated in the UK general election. He did it again in 92, both times without permission from Durham to use the character. Later, in 2017, Jonathan Harvey donned the outfit and ran against Theresa May. Durham objected to the use, but said he would be okay if anyone else wanted to portray the character, as long as they got permission first. And people did, since he ran again in 2019. And I get a kick out of this, so it's a 3. Like, it doesn't really work, but it's silly enough and has a fair amount of charm to make it a fun watch. The significance is just a 1.5 though, since it's really obscure and not known, although since it had early appearances for Elliot and Poundstone and then played an odd role in UK politics, it gets that extra 0.5. Should you watch it? Probably. It's dumb and cheap, but it's still a good time and a little off-kilter curiosity.
Let me get this straight. You say these aliens, they were small, brown, and very, very quiet?
That's right. Yes.
Mrs. Tunnelston, I don't know exactly how to tell you this, but I think they were actually some of your dog's duty piles.
Oh.
Our final film on this block came out on September 7th, although it did play at the Cannes Film Market earlier in May, and it's The Warrior and the Sorceress. This has Kung Fu's Kane, and here he's playing... Yeah, he's also called Kane, although it's spelled differently, so I guess it's not the same character. He used to be a part of a group of holy warriors called the Homoraks, but they've been long gone, and he's now a mercenary. And it seems like water is a scarce commodity, and two villages battle over the only well. Kane likes to sit around and show off his legs, and he strolls into town to say that he'll work for whoever pays more. He's called up first by Bel Kaz, who has this lizard turtle thing with him and diapers, but he plans to hire Kane, but then kill him to get his money back after he's killed his rival. That rival is Zeg, and he has a sorceress with him, and she's Maria Sokas. And we're going to be seeing a lot of her in the next couple of years in Sword of Sorcery movies. And when I say a lot of her, I mean in a different way than in this movie, because this is her outfit throughout the whole film. So we might as well just call her character Black Bar. But there's also a group of slavers that everyone is against, but the Dark One decides to ditch Balkaz and then takes money from Zeg. But then when Kane comes face to chest with Naja, he discovers that she was also a Hammurack. And then he has to fight this thing, whatever this thing is. He also encounters, and I realize that this is another Black Bar situation, a woman with 4 boobs. Yep, before Total Recall. This is the OG Quadratitty lady. But can the Dark One save the town? And I'm not sure if that plot synopsis sounds familiar, but it's essentially another take on the classic Akira Kurosawa flick Yojimbo. That had already been redone as A Fistful of Dollars, and later would be the basis of Last Man Standing and Omega Doom. This one was from Roger Corman's production company, New World Pictures, and he had just made Deathstalker and was fully embracing the sword and sorcery world. The director was John C. Broderick, and he did that job very little, as this was one of only 5 things that he directed, but he would work in the industry in a number of other jobs. Seems like he had an interesting time with this movie, since Carradine claimed that the reason that Maria Sokas was naked all throughout the film was that Broderick was obsessed with her and just wanted to see her topless all the time. Also, during editing, he went over schedule and got into a fight with Corman, so he ended up quitting, causing the final cut to be overseen by various teams in other countries, creating an uneven experience. Also, originally the script was merely influenced by Yojimbo, but writer William Stout was horrified to discover that Broderick had rewritten it and changed a good amount of the dialogue to make it more like the Kurosawa film, to the point that Stout considered it plagiarism. The reviews were fine for what it was, although most pointed out that the idea wasn't original, and it did earn around $3 million at the box office, although there's no accurate budget information to declare if it was profitable or not. And I wasn't too into this one, so it gets a 2. I really like the Yojimbo story, and this is just a lifeless retelling, and Carradine just does not have the charisma to pull this character off. The SFCS is a 1.5 since it got a little attention, but not much, with only Carradine's name attached. Also, it mostly blends with the number of other similarly themed and titled films from the same time frame. Should you watch it? I'd say no, unless you just really want to see the 4-boob lady. Okay, apparently we have to start this episode by going back a bit and go back to March 9th, because Joe Lotion asked why I didn't include Splash, and I realized I should have, because it's clearly fantasy and falls into that category, so here we go. Splash. It starts with Wole Bole 20 years ago, as a little Alan and his brother Freddy are on the water with the family by Cape Cod, and he sees something in there that compels him to just jump in. There, he encounters a little girl, but he's pulled back up, and they sail away. But it's revealed that she has a fishtail. 20 years later, Alan is now the owner of Bubba Gump Shrimp, and also a produce company, along with Freddy, who is now Harry Crumb.
Who put this goddamn fruit here?
Alan can't tell his girlfriend that he loves her, so she leaves him, which makes him yell at Clint Howard. Depressed, he goes back to Cape Cod, where he encounters Johnny Rose and accidentally falls into the water and gets hit on the head. He's rescued, though, by a mysterious replicant, and she's naked, unless you're watching the dumb Disney Plus version with the CGI hair covering her butt. She just swims away, but she's that same mermaid girl from the opening, and Kornbluth spots her underwater. She decides that she needs to go track Alan down, and she's so annoyed at this turtle right here. Like, look at how mad she gets. Like, lady, he's just trying to turt down there. She shows up nude at the Statue of Liberty.
French citizens, it has come to symbolize hope for naked women everywhere. Bocce balls!
And the police find Alan's wallet on her and call him, so he takes her home with him. And she learns English by watching TV. They also walk by a movie theater showing both Evil Dead and Extra, which is pretty awesome, but right next to it is the one showing The Mistress, Sweet Cheeks, and Skin Tight. Decisions. She chooses the name Madison, and I'll talk about that in a second, but she only has 6 days there before she has to go home, because again, she's a mermaid. A fact that she hides from Alan, but the trouble arises when Kornbluth is humiliated for his claims of a fish woman and decides to try to reveal her presence to the world. And this was an earlier directorial effort from Ron Howard, and it was also the first big project for Tom Hanks as well. The producers originally wanted a known actor and considered Chevy Chase and John Travolta for the role, but then opted to go with a lesser-known player to have the character be more of an everyman. Kinda hard to believe, but the budget wasn't that big, at only $11 million, but when it was released, it was met with a good amount of positivity and strong reviews that praised Hanks, Hannah, and Howard's direction. It was even nominated for an Oscar for Best Screenplay and a Golden Globe for Best Picture, musical or comedy, but it didn't win any of those. But it was a big hit. It made around $70 million at the box office and was one of the highest grossing films of the year. 4 years later, they made a sequel called Splash TOO2 that was made for television, although all of the major players were recast and the only returning actor would be Dodie Goodman as the wacky receptionist. There's been attempts to make a remake for a while, and one is still bouncing around out there, and at one point Channing Tatum was connected to play a merman. But there's one other influence that this one has had. You see, the name Madison didn't exist before this movie. Like, well, it did, but it was an obscure name for men that fell out of favor in the early part of the 20th century. Like, her picking the name Madison was supposed to be funny, because it was, as Alan says, not a name. But then, because of this film, it became one, and in modern times is one of the most popular female names in use. And I'll go with a 3.5 out of 5 on this. I think it's a lot of fun, but honestly, Alan is such a dick that it's hard to be on his character's side. Like, Hanks does a great job with him, but he's just written as a spoiled man baby that's hard to like. But it's a cute flick, and Candy and Levy steal the show, while Daryl Hannah steals your heart. The sci-fi cultural significance is a 4 though, since it was very popular, kickstarted an entire name, and launched Hanks as a major comic actor, but it's not on that next level of recognition in terms of longevity and being a franchise or whatever. Like, modern audiences aren't as familiar with it as they once were, so it's hard to give it higher. Should you watch it? Yes, and then yell, "What a week I'm having."
Hey, Roaring! Jag hör en turf and in Tom's penis.
Back to our regularly scheduled year now as we move further into 84 and get to one that I can't wait to talk about, since on September 14th we had the arrival of the brother from another planet. It begins with an alien ship crash landing on Ellis Island, and when the pilot emerges, it's Miles Dyson. He appears to be missing a foot and can't talk, but the next morning his foot has regrown, although he only has 3 toes and funky nails. He wanders around New York trying to figure out how things work, and he has the ability to open a cash register, but seems to understand what a police officer is based on his badge and gun. He goes into a bar where Kung Fu Joe is hanging out, as is Old Moses, and also Daryl Edwards, and coincidentally enough, he also had a tiny role in Splash as one of the reporters. There, he also encounters Sam, a social worker, and he helps him out by finding him a place to stay with a single mother. Not only can he fix electronic devices by touching them, but he can also heal injuries too. But then there's these 2 creepy looking guys, and they have a picture of the brother and are looking for him. And he just sort of listens to people as they talk about their troubles and the state of the world. The men in black come to a bar and claim the brother is an illegal alien, where he meets Vince Latello, who does him a card trick, and then a couple of tourists who are lost, and then becomes infatuated with pictures of a singer. After encountering a series of different people with their stories in the city, revealing that he is a slave that is on the run, as the men in black search for him, the people he encounters cover him to keep him hidden. But he may not be alone, because he spots some writing on the wall from his own species. Oh yeah, did I mention he can take out his eyeball and see through it? And this is a great flick from John Sayles, who both wrote it and directed. And keep in mind, this is the man who wrote the original Piranha, Battle Beyond the Stars, Alligator, and The Howling, and this was an early directorial effort from him, but he'd go on to do some higher profile stuff like 8 Man Out, Passion Fish, and Lone Star, the latter 2 which he'd get Oscar nominations for. While Sayles was making a film called Leanna, he had a series of dreams that inspired the story of this one, and while he was looking for funds for his bigger budget and higher profile drama Matawan, he had the opportunity to get this made, so he jumped on it. The budget was only $350,000, and some of it came from a grant, but most of it was self-financed, and the reviews were extremely positive, with most of the praise going to Morton's silent performance. And here's the weird part. The film was a surprise success, earning $4 million at the theater, but someone on the production team failed to process the copyright information properly. So, on the day it opened in theaters, it became part of public domain and anyone could release it. But, Later on, they released a DVD version with a commentary track from Sales, and the commentary was copywritten, so that version is protected. It's also gone on to become a minor cult classic, and I'm honestly surprised that no one has tried to remake it by this point, considering its relevance in today's landscape. And I'm a strong 4 on this one, and part of me wants to go 4.5, so maybe an honorary 4.25, but it's such a great film with wonderful characters and performances and a great message. I know I've said it repeatedly, but the Sci-Fi of '84 has shown it over and over that strong political and social messages have always been prevalent in genre films. The significance is just a 2 though, because it's never really caught on in terms of name recognition and has never risen higher than the cult fringe, but it has a number of names involved, which has earned a cool spot in the sci-fi world. Should you watch it? Hell yeah, this is worth a look.
Want to see me make all the white people disappear?
59th Street, Columbus Circle, 125th Street next. This is the Uptown A Express going to 27. Change for the AA local across the platform. The D. On the upper level, change for the number 1 Broadway train.
What'd I tell you?
This next one is a little bit funny to have on here, since it's a part of a series, and the other entries were out in the early 80s, but I didn't cover them because they didn't qualify. And on the same day, September 14th, we had Ninja 3, The Domination. The opening has a man entering a cave and opening a secret compartment to reveal a number of ninja-themed weaponry, and then suits up and goes to a golf course where he takes out a whole security squad and kills a man in broad daylight. And I love this, because I guess he just hid in these trees all day, because I know he wasn't just strolling around the course in this outfit from tree patch to tree patch. A huge police chase is kicked off involving helicopter shenanigans and throwing star deaths, and eventually, after like 30 guys with guns are unable to take out one dude with a sword, they manage to shoot him up. But then he vanishes, burying himself in the ground somehow. We then meet a telephone line repairman who might get electrocuted and experience some actual electric boogaloo, and the ninja hypnotizes her, and then something mystical happens between the two of them. The police question her.
Thanks, but I don't use soft drinks.
Oh man, I'm envious. I went to rehab and finally got myself clean, but then fell right off the wagon and started using soft drinks again. A cop flirts with her, like, aggressively. Like she says no very firmly, and an hour later, he's calling her and asking again, and she again turns him down, so he follows her to her aerobics class. Like, take a hint, dude. There's then a group of gym dudes just shaking down a lady outside, and man, the men in this film sure are class acts. And after she fights them, the cop then arrests her.
And if you don't want to go out with me just because I'm a cop, then the hell with you, lady.
Class acts. All of them. Well, I guess that child's temper tantrum won her over though, because she invites him over and bones him while pouring V8 on her chest. And let me check. Yep, written by a dude. That night, she has a vision of a floating sword, and then the next day spots a man and follows him. But then, oh no! Neon video games and smoke machines and laser lights. We're definitely in the 80s now. Before you know it, she's decked out in his ninja gear and taking out that guy from earlier, and it soon becomes apparent that she's possessed by the spirit of the ninja and getting revenge on the cops who shot him. But they need help, so they go to get some from Lopan, which leads to a pretty ridiculous exorcism. And an important fact:
only a ninja can destroy a ninja.
And this may be Ninja 3, but don't worry, you're not missing anything if you haven't seen the first two. Those were 1981's Enter the Ninja and 83's Revenge of the Ninja, but the films had no actual connection to each other outside of sharing a couple of actors, although playing different roles in each. They were also straightforward action films with no supernatural or fantasy elements like the one on display here. It was directed by Sam Furstenberg, who also did the second film and would later go on to handle the American Ninja series, and also Breakin' 2. It was produced by Canon Films, and they had a deal with Lucinda Dickey and really thought that she could be the next big thing. They put her in Breakin' and Breakin' 2, and then this, but their follow-up films, Breakin' 3 and a King Solomon's Mine movie, either didn't happen or instead used a different actress. This one cost $2 million to make, a big jump from the $700K that Revenge of the Ninja cost, and closer to the $1.5 million budget of Enter the Ninja. However, whereas the first two entries made around $15 million each, this one only earned around $7 million, half of those. Because of this, no further follow-ups were made. And this is fun. It's a 3. It's not very good, but it's always entertaining, although sometimes for the wrong reasons. The SFCS is a 2.5 since it had a little bit of notoriety, but not all that much, and it got a good amount of cable play and was seen quite a bit and then became a so bad it's good cult classic. Should you watch it? Yeah, get dominated and then see the movie.
Oh, Billy, help me. I'm scared.
We're going to take a little detour up to Canada now and also to the small screen because on September 22nd we were Overdrawn at the Memory Bank. It starts with showing us Gomez Addams, and then I swear it was going to do the Doctor Who opening. It's the future, and Aram works for this big corporation called NovaCorp, and he spends his time just watching Casablanca. When he's caught, he has to go to something called a psychist, and this is shot on the classic video that old made-for-TV stuff was done on, and he's assigned to rehabilitation.
Listen, Felicia, I've asked you out 67 times. You always say no.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Here's a hint. Maybe after the second no, you stop. Part of the rehab is a process called a doppel, where your mind is transferred into an animal. And while reporting in, he's monitored by a woman named Apollonia. And this is a weird coincidence, since she's played by Linda Griffiths, and one of the few films that she did before this one was Leanna, that John Sayles movie that I spoke about earlier. They expose their brains in order to do it, and then let a bunch of kids in. And are you kidding? That is just like asking for Cheerios in their cerebellum or something. So, Aram doppels into a monkey, but when he's attacked by an elephant, he requests to be pulled early. But, oops, they've misplaced his body, so his mind is lost in the system. And when word of it gets out, NovaCorp's stock crumbles. And the head of the River Rats is here, and they're told to find his body quick, or they'll terminate his mind in the system. Apollonia decides to allow Fingal the ability to create his own simulated world while she interfaces with him and informs him of the situation through an avatar of his mom. But then things get weird when a man doing an impression of Peter Lorre shows up, and then he's straight up in Casablanca, in which another version of him is Bogey. But try as they may to keep him reined in and just go back to his old job, he decides to fight back and tear down the whole company. Although not right away. Actually, right away he goes back and asks his co-worker to sleep with him for the 68th time, and she says no again. So he asks again, but this time used his ability to shape the simulation to make her say yes. But things get weird when they find his body and plan to give it a sex change? Okay, so I mentioned this was a TV movie, and it was by Douglas Williams, and all of his work is in the TV realm, including a handful of episodes of Fraggle Rock. It was based on a short story from 1976 with that same name, and even though the exact budget isn't known, producers claimed that it was well into 7 figures. It ran on Canadian TV and then screened in the US on PBS as a part of American Playhouse, and the reviews weren't great, but it's hard to say how well it performed, although the producers claimed that they were happy with it. But much later, it was the focus of a season finale of MST3K, and the film received a pretty vicious ribbing. And that episode is often considered one of the best of the series. And this is a bit of a mess, but I can't say I thought it was terrible, so I'll go 2 with it. It's mostly dull, but I kind of dig that shot-on-video glaze it has, and the concepts are cool, if it only did something with them. The SFCS is just a 1.5 because it is mostly not known, although it does have a handful of people you'll know, but most of that 0.5 is for the notoriety it got on Mystery Science Theater. Should you watch it? Maybe not. It's kind of interesting, but I'll admit it's better with Robot Shadows making fun of it. Get ready to bring things down a bit, and let's cross the ocean to the UK and stay on the small screen as September 23rd brought us Threads. We're in Sheffield, and the news talks about tensions between the USSR, America, and Iran, and Russia has invaded Iran after the US backed a coup there. Ruth and Jimmy find out that they're pregnant and plan to get married, but the news just keeps up with things escalating and sunken ships and troops deployed. People start protesting, and the UK commits to helping NATO, but people fear nuclear attacks and then start panic buying. But then, the combat begins as the American troops and Russian troops start fighting, and people try to get out of the cities, and confusion sets in. There are some news reports about possible nuclear explosions in the Middle East, and riots start breaking out, and we check in on Jimmy and Ruth as they deal with the situation. People start building fallout shelters, but then it happens, and the air raid sirens go off, and nukes are launched. The initial blast destroys massive amounts of property, and people panic as Sheffield is targeted since it's an industrial center. Jimmy gets into a truck to find Ruth, and their families are all caught in a blast. And everything burns, and it's just really dark. Like if you watch The Day After and were like, this is a shocking view of what a nuclear blast would be like, then this movie is going to destroy you. Jimmy's mom is burns all over, but now the fallout hits the area, and his father appears to be suffering from radiation poisoning. And yeah, everything's ruined. It's all destroyed, and it all gets worse from here. And you know, I thought that The Day After and Testament were bleak, and I'm not going to say that they weren't, but this is the one that really shows how awful and straight up apocalyptic that a nuclear war would be. And it's insane to think it ran on television. The director was Mick Jackson, and he had previously done a documentary series about Armageddon, and his career would take a much lighter turn in the 90s, where he would do Steve Martin's LA Story, and then The Bodyguard, and then Volcano. A huge amount of research went into the script by Barry Hines, and it's since been called the closest vision of what a nuclear war's results would be. It aired on the BBC, and the ratings were strong, but after a return screening in 1985, it wasn't aired again until around 20 years later. It did get nominations for a bunch of BAFTAs and won 4 of them, including Best Drama. Over time, it's developed a reputation as a jarring and horrifying work and a haunting warning, and it's earned a huge cult following, and even had an action figure made of the traffic warden character. Recently, there's been discussions about a reboot, a TV series by the team that made Adolescence, but it's still in the early stages. And I'm going big with this one. It's a 4.5. This movie is haunting. I know I have this in the Sci-Fi project, but it's one of the most horrific films I've ever seen. And the way they film it, making it feel like a newsreel or procedural film, just evokes a realness that unsettles me. I love it, and I just hate watching it. The SFCS is only a 2 though, and if you're watching this in the UK, you'll probably disagree, but I rate this part based on its impact in the US, and this one just didn't hit that hard over here. Should you watch it? Yeah, but be prepared to be really bummed out afterwards. Alright, we're back in the US now, and we're back on the big screen. And we're back to movies that won't make us depressed with September 28th's Impulse. It has Agnes of God here, along with Otter, and one day her mother calls her, just starts swearing at her, and then shoots herself. They go to her hometown because of it, and we find out that she didn't die, and is in the hospital. We see an odd set of tracks through a field, and she returns to her old house. Her brother is Chet, so she's stewed buttwad, but it seems that before this happened, there was an earthquake that surprised the town. But then, they notice that people are acting strange and aggressive, and there's an incident at the bank that calls the attention of Lieutenant Chapman. This guy tries to cut in and gets really angry when Jennifer turns him down, but after this block of films, I'm confused. Doesn't that make him the hero of the film? After they encounter more angry people, they go to see the doctor, but they're lucky that he's not in a cocoon, but he's clearly affected as well, as he kills Jen's mom. Everything escalates, and soon the sheriff is shooting kids for vandalism, but after a while, it seems like even Stewart is falling victim to it. But then, when they all figure out the cause of it, will they be able to stop it? Especially when Peter Jason is involved. So, this little thriller is coming at you from Graham Baker, and we encountered him a while back on the 81 project with The Final Conflict. Later in the 80s, we'll see him on the Sci-Fi project with Alienation. Originally, Louis Teague was slated to direct, but he instead opted to go do Cat's Eye, so Baker stopped in to finish the job. It had a decent-sized budget of $10 million, and that might sound pretty standard, but it's interesting to me that this movie was only $1 million less than Splash. It wasn't nearly as big of a hit though, and only scrounged up less than $3 million at the box office, marking it as a dud. And I'm gonna give it a 2.5. I like the idea, and it's doing some cool stuff with the atmosphere, but the characters are all super flat, and the pacing is way too slow. The SFCS is just a 1.5 since it vanished quickly and no one talked about it at all, but it did have a number of names involved, so it got some recognition. Should you watch it? I'd say no, but you might have a different impulse. This next one actually got a full release late in '85, but it did have a premiere at a Chicago Film Festival in October of '84, and it's City Limits. It takes place 15 years from now, and when movies say that, I think they're intending that it's like always 15 years from whenever you're watching, but I usually relate it to its release, so I suppose it's meant to be 1999. Cougar is here, and he returns home to his adoptive father, Mufasa. He tells us that some sort of plague killed off most of the adults in the world, and he survived and raised Lee, but recently had to let him roam free to find adventure. He wears this skull helmet and intends to find and join the Clippers, a motorcycle gang. He goes to LA to find them, but immediately runs afoul of factory workers and a rival gang. He does finally meet the Clippers though, and one of their members is Charlie, and another is Cruiser, but they don't let him in their little club. He does meet up with Yogi though, and she's Radon Chong, and you may say to yourself, weird, she doesn't look anything like her father, Tommy Chong. Well, look up her mother Maxine Sneed and realize that her genetics were freaking strong, because they might as well be clones. But then, when it turns out that one of their rivals died in trying to get him, they want blood, and the Clippers agree to allow a trial by combat. But the head of the DAs is working with the boss of that factory, so when the fight is about to go down, Gracie Law shows up as a representative of the company, and Lee manages to win the battle, becoming an official member. But when Bolo, the factory leader, is trying to force both gangs to work for him and kills Whitey, Wickens goes out to get in touch with them and fight back. This one was directed by Aaron Lipstadt and is only his second feature. Previously, he had made the super low budget Android that was covered back in '82, and right after this, he'd go full force into directing TV shows, including Miami Vice, The Equalizer, and Quantum Leap. The success of Android got him some leeway to access around $2.5 million to get this one made, and he reused a number of the actors from that one. Although I mentioned that this was first screened at a film festival, that version of the film isn't available to view. After that screening, they went back and did a number of reshoots and added a completely new music score, although there doesn't seem to be any information about what those reshoots entailed. It did get a theatrical release, but there doesn't seem to be any numbers involved to know how well it did, but it then went on to the home market. Like some others here, it also got some attention by getting riffed on by Joel and the Bots, but for the most part has been forgotten. And it's okay, it's a 2.5. The story's fine, but nothing we haven't seen before, and for a post-apocalyptic future, it sure seems like everything is just a warehouse. The SFCS is just a 1.5 since it didn't make any sort of mark on the genre at all, but I'll give it a minor boost for having a good amount of known actors involved. Should you watch it? It's somewhat skippable. Like, there's far better dystopian future movies out there, some of them right on this block.
You got ideas, Lee?
Yeah, I got lots of ideas, Mick.
Alright, let's end this next block in a big way. Big in terms of size of the main character. And this next one has an unknown date, but it did release at some point in '84, and it's Godzilla Fantasia, otherwise known as Godzilla Fantasia. I probably won't talk too much about this one because of its nature, but right away here, you can kind of get the idea of what this is, and the word Fantasia being in the title tips it off. It's a clip show movie, just giving you snippets of the entire Goji saga up until this point. Like, you see, the last movie with the big G was back in 1975 with Terror of Mechagodzilla, and the character's popularity and box office had waned. But the time was right for a resurgence, and we'll talk more about that a little later in '84. But the people were interested in the character again, and the hype for a new entry had begun. So there was a concert. It featured the music of Akira Ifukube, who had done a good deal of the scores for the various Godzilla films, including the very first one. So they organized a 3-act symphonic Fantasia concerto that featured music from the series and held it at the Tokyo Metropolitan Hibiya Public Hall in August of 1983. It was a big event and even had Akihiko Hirata, the actor who played Dr. Serizawa in Godzilla 54, come out and introduce the show, in character. The first half of this special presentation is the contents of that performance, set to clips from the franchise. And that was it for the live performance and the symphony, but that's not where this film version ends, since it goes on for a whole second half. That portion uses selections from a musician named Makoto Inoue, and over the course of 1983 to '84, he released 3 different albums that were tributes to those classic Godzilla scores, done with a synthesizer. So, the second half of this film plays selections from that, mostly similar to those featured on the symphony, also set to clips from the old films. If you're looking for a story or something, you're not getting it here, since it's just a selection of stuff with the big man in it and his associates from a bunch of the old movies. But if you're a fan of seeing big lizard action, this is just that, set to a gorgeous soundtrack. And I don't know how to rate this, so I'll give it a 3. This isn't something that I would watch, but I love having it on in the background while I do other things. The music is astounding, and who doesn't just love seeing Godzilla crush cities? The SFCS is just a 1.5 though, since it's not like it's an actual Godzilla movie, and it's one that's not talked about much, but I'll give it a 0.5 because it's Godzilla. Should you watch it? If you're looking to watch a movie, then no. But if you're just in the mood to see kaiju calamities set to rad tunes, then give it a go. We're starting this one off with a movie that I wasn't quite sure where to place, but I figured it probably belongs more on sci-fi and fantasy. But on May 15th at Cannes, there was the premiere of Ghost Warrior, which then got released on video, but not until 1986. It begins back in 1552 with a young woman held captive being rescued by a lone warrior. He puts up a strong fight, but she's killed, and he's ultimately shot with an arrow and falls into the icy lake below. It then jumps ahead to the present as a couple of hikers find the cave and go in, discovering the warrior encased in ice, Steve Rogers style. A young reporter is assigned to the case, and she watches as doctors try to revive him. He's found with a katana on him, and if you're wondering what katana means,
it means Japanese sword.
He awakens, and damn, 400 years really does wonders for your hair apparently, because this man is coiffed. He's really confused, and they try to communicate with him, and at first it seems to go well, but then one of the orderlies finds out how much those swords are worth and tries to steal them. This lets him loose, and he watches Dungeon Master on TV, which is pretty weird considering it had just came out, but then he heads out onto the streets. He's amazed by modern society, but also encounters a gang of hoodlums harassing an old man, and uses his sword to chop them up. This kicks off a minor gang war with them, and he has to slice and dice his way through them, ending up in Xanadu. And the race is on to stop him and bring him back before he goes overboard with The Killing. And this one was produced by Empire Pictures and directed by J. Larry Carroll, who was mostly known as a writer, but was also the editor of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Weirdly, although it was his bread and butter, he didn't write this one, but he did the scripts for Tourist Trap, The Day the Time Ended, and then would go on to a really long career in TV, especially cartoons. This would actually serve as the only thing that he directed. It featured Hiroshi Fujioka in the lead role, and he may never have been that well known over here, but this is the OG Kamen Rider, and was also the Sega spokesman for a while. Although it was released as Ghost Warrior here, it was mostly known for its other title, Sword Kill, and I guess had a hard time getting into video stores, with the 2 years that it took to reach the home market. And that's likely because it's not great. I'm only going to give it a 2.5 out of 5 here. It starts strong, but then just not enough happens, although Fujioka really seems to be giving us all to the role. The sci-fi cultural significance is just A1 since it's not well known at all and barely fits the genre and just didn't impact the film world at all. Should you watch it? Probably not, but you won't be mad if you do. The next one is really appropriate for the year that we're talking about, and it debuted in London on October 10th and played a limited run in the US in December, and it's 1984. Funny thing is that it went wider in the US in March of '85. And like, come on guys, you need the movie called 1984 to come out in 1984. Way to drop that ball. So it's set in an alternate 1984, one where people are ruled over by a group called The Party, and their leader, Big Brother, who makes appearances on these big screens and delivers propaganda to the people, who emphatically cheer him on. We meet John Merrick, who works at the Ministry of Truth and alters the reports to come in as to fit the company line. But at home, hidden behind a brick, he's got a diary where he discusses committing thought crime, which is the act of having thoughts that don't align with the government's desires. Everyone also has these giant screens in their home where they can be monitored and directly communicated with. And their messages have nothing to do with fact, as they just make up the information that they feed to people. His life is pretty normal until one day he meets a woman who passes him a note that says she loves him, and they start a secret romance, sharing illegal information and ideas. But everything goes wrong when it turns out that a picture in their hidden loft contains a screen, and they were able to see them, so they're arrested and brought to what's called the Ministry of Love, essentially a brainwashing prison where he's tortured by Mark Antony. But is this the kind of movie in which the small revolution can overcome the crushing governmental overreach, or will Winston Smith succumb to the thought police? So, yeah, this is an adaptation of the classic George Orwell novel 1984, which was written in 1949. It was the second major version of it, with the first being all the way back in '56, which is interesting since there was a version that was showing you the world as the future, and now you have a new one showing it as an alternate present. The director was Michael Radford, and he had just done the war drama Another Time, Another Place, and this was fairly early in his career, which had been odd. He didn't make another film until '87, and then took another break until '94, and has essentially just been sporadic in what he makes, jumping from genre to genre. The original idea was to shoot the film in black and white to give it that oppressive dystopia look, but the money guys were against it, so they instead used a bleach bypass process which gives the film a washed out look. One of the weirdest things about this one was the hubbub about the music. It seems it was financed by Richard Branson of Virgin Films and Records, and they got the Eurythmics to do the music. However, Radford didn't want that, and he insisted on an orchestral score that had already been completed, but Virgin just replaced it, so the director disowned that version. Now, due to rights issues, nowadays some versions couldn't have the Eurythmics songs on there, so the original score was substituted, so that one is more of the original vision, but currently both scores are available to compare. It was favorably reviewed, and even though it wasn't a big hit, it did make money, won a number of awards, and earned a solid cult following. It would also turn out to be Richard Burton's final film, as he died shortly before it was released. It features a dedication to him. Weirdly, it's been the last major adaptation of the work, although there's been several attempts to make them, even recently, but the strangest remake has been Reality, just straight up doing its own version right in front of us. And this is a hard watch, but it's a good one, so it's a 4. Don't watch it if you're not ready to have your mood ruined. And yeah, the book is rather dark, but this film just went straight up bleak, but it's so well done. The sci-fi cultural significance is a 3, since it's a big take on one of the most known novels of all time, but a good amount of the impact is down to the book itself, and this version was not really a huge success and didn't quite become the same level of phenomenon. Should you watch it? Yeah, and be freaked out by how similar it is to, right now. Here's a big one of the biggest, because on October 26th, Judgment Day began, because that's when we were introduced to the Terminator. It begins in 2029, a mere 4 years from now, and it's a war-torn apocalypse with tanks and planes shooting lasers at human soldiers on the ground. A text tells us the machines had risen up and destroyed humanity amidst nuclear fire, so there was a war at some point. But then we jump back to 1984, and we see some sort of electric phenomena, and in the middle is a giant muscle-bound man who's not only a commando, but he's going commando. He's at the Griffith Park Observatory and encounters a trio of punks, and it's kind of wild because it's Paxton, the Night Slasher, and this guy. I kind of feel bad for this guy, considering that the other two went on to huge, long careers, and David Kristen here did one movie and one episode of Moonlighting after this, and then quit. I guess he also passed away from cancer back in 2012, So let's hear it for this guy, Unsung Punker. But then we see another naked man appear, and this one is Corporal Hicks, and he's chased by police. And next, we see Sarah Connor, and there's literally nothing else I would ever call Linda Hamilton. She works at this restaurant that's about 3 blocks away from me, but it's closed now. And we see the big guy go to a gun shop that Mr. Futterman works at, and he tells him that wherever the red dot goes, ya bang. And he murders a woman named Sarah Connor. Sarah's roommate's boyfriend could be a fireman soon, and there's a couple of cops investigating the rash of murders of women named Sarah Connor, and one of them is a Starfleet officer, while the other is a straight-up synthetic. Soon though, we find out that this Sarah is also being hunted down by the large one, while Reese is trying to protect her, and also protect the future. And this is another one that I know that I'm describing what happens in the movie, but I know that you know it anyway because it's the freaking Terminator, man!
Come with me if you want to live.
Robot from the future comes back to kill the mother of the leader of the resistance, but accidentally ends up causing his conception instead. Because yeah, I know that this is one that people have a hard time grasping, but Kyle Reese was never not John's dad. There's no original timeline. This film was created to be a fixed loop, and this is the only version of events. But I digress. So this is my sci-fi megastar, James Cameron. But keep in mind, at this point, he had only directed Piranha 2, and he was fired from that one very early on. So it's not even really his work. So this is essentially his feature debut. It began life as a horror script, but started getting more sci-fi influence as it developed, and an early version had 2 Terminators, with one being made of liquid metal. That was removed though, due to him not feeling like it was possible to pull off, but I think you know that it would be revisited later on. Cameron also initially wanted Lance Henriksen to play the Terminator, but then Schwarzenegger was brought in, although to play Reese. And after chatting with a bit, the director realized he was perfect for the evil bot. Funnily enough, Arnold didn't want to do it and thought the movie would be trash, but thought it would be low profile enough that it wouldn't damage his career. The budget was only $6.4 million, and the studio didn't think it would do all that much, but it opened up and was #1 at the box office. Keep in mind, its only competition at this point was the debut of both Terror in the Isles and Body Double, but it beat them both and held the #1 spot the following week. In the end, it earned $78 million worldwide and was considered a solid hit, although not a massive sensation. That would come later.
Get out.
It did really well on the home market and became a pretty beloved film, and it took a while, but in 1991, Terminator 2 would be released and be a massive success, and several other sequels would follow, with several sorts of reboots and half-discarded continuity. But there would be plenty more. There was a TV show, The Sarah Connor Chronicles, that ran for 2 seasons, as well as video games, novels, comic books, action figures, pretty much everything outside of a Saturday morning cartoon show. It's not known if the franchise is definitely dead, although Arnold has claimed that he's through with it, although Cameron has suggested that he may have an idea to do something else with it. But considering how the past couple were, I think we're likely better off if he won't be back after all. Oh, and don't put in the comments that O.J. Simpson was originally going to be the Terminator. One person brought it up one time in a meeting and they all said no to it in like 5 seconds. And this is a perfect film to me. It's a 5. I love the Terminator. And maybe it's because I'm a sucker for time travel movies, but it's also one where the time travel totally works and makes sense. Plus, the characters are great, the action is great, everything about it is awesome. The SFCS is also a 5 because there's few films that have had as much impact on modern pulp culture as the Terminator. Sure, more people have probably seen the sequel, but this is still very widely seen and known with iconic characters and situations. Should you watch it? Yeah, come with me if you want to watch.
I'll be back.
Man, I'm ecstatic about this 1-2 punch right now because on November 7th in the UK, with a Las Vegas screening in the US a couple of weeks later, we have Trancers. We're set in the future and everything is very neon. And meet the future doll man. And he mentions killing a cult leader named Whistler who had zombie-like slaves called Trancers, and he's hunting them down. We see him take one of them out, and he's approached by a co-worker, Babe Ruth, and we find out that a Trancer killed Jack's wife. Seems like in the future, LA is a sunken city called Los Angeles, but Death is called in and told that Whistler is still alive and gone back in time to 300 years ago in Los Angeles and is killing the Council's ancestors, causing them to blip out of existence, which is oddly close to the whole Terminator plot, which is kinda wild that they arrived so close to each other. Their plan is to send Death after him to protect their families, and they bring in someone that knows a bit about family matters. And they give him a special watch that has something called a long second. When you push the button, it stretches 1 second into 10 for the wearer. They then send him back, and things work differently there, because instead of just going back in time, they send your consciousness into someone in your family line from that era. And Jack ends up in the body of his, great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. That guy is dating Jamie Buckman, and he tells her what's going on, but she doesn't believe him until Santa turns into a Trancer and attacks. But then, it turns out that Whistler has transferred into his ancestor, a cop, and it's now up to Jack and Lena to protect the Council's bloodline while fighting Trancers and evading the police. And this one's by Mr. Charlie Band, future creator of Full Moon, although this was still during the Empire Pictures era. He had just done Metal Storm, as well as a portion of The Dungeon Master, and also produced those, and this was their next big release. Keep in mind, at this point, Helen Hunt wasn't quite an unknown, since she had done a string of TV appearances as a child actress before this, but Trancers would be her first major film role, but shortly after would start getting much bigger work. One of those works is the feature film As Good As It Gets, with Jack Nicholson and Greg Kinnear. And here's a little tidbit. Kinnear was actually an intern with Empire Pictures at an early point in his career, and promoting this film was one of his first gigs with them. The budget was low at around $400K, and it had a rough time at the box office since it didn't have strong distribution and only screened in the US in a handful of theaters. But it did really well on home video and cable, and soon developed a strong cult following. It was strong enough that a few years later they shot a 20-minute sequel called Trancers, City of Lost Angels, which was intended to be a part of an anthology film called Pulse Pounders. But that film was never released, and the sequel was put on a shelf, although it can now be seen separately. It got an actual sequel in 1991, which both Thomerson and Hunt returned, even though she was much more successful at this point. That was followed up by several more entries, and Hunt returned for part of the third film, and Thomerson would be in the rest except for part 6, where Death is forced to inhabit the body of a different female ancestor. One thing that this film sort of glosses over is the fact that Jack's mind takes over the body of his ancestor Phil and says his mind is sort of taking a break, but in the end, Jack is stuck in the past, and the movie treats it like a good thing, so it's sort of funny that just no one cared that Phil was just essentially sent into a coma forever. And man, I have a soft spot for this movie. I give it a 4. I love the fresh take on time travel, the noir thing that is going on, the whole long second watch aspect. There's just so much that I love here, and I dig it. The SFCS is just a 2.5 though, because it did get a bunch more recognition than some of the others and formed its own franchise, but it's still not widely seen and is still only a cult thing. Should you watch it? Yep, give a chancer to good old Trancers.
What are you doing?
Dry hairs for squids.
Here's another one that I wasn't quite sure where to place because it could sort of be horror, but but since it leans more fantasy, I'll put it here. And on TV, on November 12th, we went to the house of Dreer. It starts in the past, showing us runaway slaves being hunted down, and then we have Reggie the Reckless in modern times, and his great-grandma warns him of dark omens that she's seen, but the family is moving to Ohio. TV Mr. Tibbs is headed off to be a professor there, and the house is said to be that of a Dutch immigrant named Dreer, who was an abolitionist back in the day, but was murdered. They arrive in a massive downpour and encounter a man who tells them to turn around while they still have a chance. Their furniture is set up for them already, and they encounter some odd stuff. And remember in Friday Part 5 when Reggie does that scream and it's super high-pitched? Well, here's the actor that plays his little brother. Dwayne Wayne is here, as is someone who knows Martin. Little Thomas investigates while this odd vocoder music plays. And he discovers hidden tunnels under the house for underground railroads. But then he encounters the eccentric Mr. Pluto, or is that Willie Brown, who lives under the ground in a cave. Meanwhile, a figure all dressed in black enters the house and seems to be looking for something, even though the doors were locked. And then there's this guy right here, and believe it or not, but this is Big Daddy, sans all the zombie makeup. But then things start to escalate when their place is trashed, with "Get Out" written up on the walls, and they discover a hidden treasure room in the caves. There's also an appearance by Mr. Sims, as the family starts to unlock the secrets of the House of Dreer. And this one was a TV movie that was from Alan A. Goldstein and was one of his first gigs. And he'd go on to a string of various low-budget flicks, with his highest profile one being the fifth Death Wish movie. It was based on a novel of the same name by Virginia Hamilton, an award-winning book from 1968, and this stands as the only adaptation of it to date. It was aired on PBS, and I didn't mention this earlier, but Mama Smalls is Gloria Foster, the Oracle from The Matrix. And it's hard to say how well this one did, and it ran on PBS, and didn't really have much in the way of ratings information. But it became a film that was actually shown in history classes and educational programs. And I enjoyed it. It's a 3. It's a bit slow at points and suffers from that TV movie budget, but this cast is stacked and really give it their all here. The significance is just a 1.5 though, since it didn't make waves and didn't really become a big hit or anything, but it gets that 0.5 for the sheer amount of known names involved. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's a different kind of watch, but it's a good one.
Papa, don't you see? First was the way he fixed the furniture downstairs in the parlor.
Boy, you letting your imagination get the best of you.
A little bit later, we got an interesting one that's a different take on a familiar face, since on November 21st, Supergirl was unleashed. It begins in a crystalline city, and we meet Billie Jean, because fair's fair, and she knows Lawrence of Arabia. And it turns out that they live in Argo City, from Krypton, but they were able to survive the planet's destruction by displacing themselves to another dimension called inner space. Kara's cousin is Kal-El, and they somehow know that he made it to Earth, and Zoltar plans to go there, and he stole something called the Omega Hedron, which he says will allow him to get there. But then, some shenanigans lead to the device being lost out into space, but Zoltar thinks that he can use his ship to go retrieve it. Kara, feeling responsible, takes it herself, and her mom and dad freak out, and trust me, Mia Farrow knows a thing or two about losing a daughter, but she's propelled through the void, and oddly, never seems that concerned about it at all. Meanwhile, on Earth, Joan Crawford is hanging out, planning on taking over the world, and the Omega Hedron just sort of lands at her feet. And she's with this guy, and you're not going to recognize him without the hair and facial hair, but imagine him saying, Mowage. Okay, so on the news, they say that Superman is off in another galaxy on a peace-seeking mission. So if you're wondering why he's not helping out in this movie, that's what he's up to. But Kara emerges from a lake, now with a full set of powers and of course, a costume that comes out of nowhere. A funny thing is that this is actually just a cardboard cutout being pulled out of the water, and you can see the wire doing it right here. Almost immediately upon getting here, she meets up with Max Headroom and is nearly raped. And yeah, that sounds about right. And she sort of just knocks them aside and nothing really happens to them, and then the movie has them sort of make a joke. Meanwhile, Selena starts to exercise her newfound powers as well, along with her sidekick, Brenda Vaccaro. But then, Kara comes across a girls' school and realizes that she needs to take on a new identity, and dons a wig and the name Linda Lee. She says that she's Clark Kent's cousin, so not only do they know about Superman, but they know his secret identity in Argo, and just by sheer coincidence, she's assigned the room with Lucy Lane, Lois's little sister. And this is weird, but Kara sees a picture of Soups, and I swear that she's like lusting over it and kind of gropes it, and that's your cousin, little Abner. But then, Ellis is here. And after Selena falls for him and a little love triangle starts up where she's now battling Supergirl over his affections, it leads to a final confrontation. So, this was after Superman 3, and it was a spin-off based on the classic DC comic character, although her background was altered a bit from the source material. Originally, this was meant to feature Superman rather prominently and have him be a mentor to Supergirl, but Christopher Reeve opted not to be involved. He did say that he'd consider a cameo in the film, but at some point before production decided against it, making the only actor to appear from the Superman series to be Mark McClure, reprising his role of Jimmy Olsen, boyfriend of Lucy Lane. Speaking of Lucy, the role was originally going to be played by Demi Moore, but she decided to leave for a bigger role in the film, Blame It on Rio. The director was Janos Vark, the man who gave us Jaws 2, and the budget was a beefy $35 million, only slightly less than Superman 3. Filming was a struggle, mainly because Faye Dunaway was reportedly a terror on set, showing up late for filming and basically being really demanding, to the point that they considered firing her at one point. Then, after a test screening thought the film was way too long, they chopped out about 30 minutes. But it didn't help much because the reviews were still rough, and the box office was too. Although it did debut at number 1 in its opening weekend, it fell quickly and only ended up earning $14 million in total, marking it as a bomb, and garnered it a couple of Razzie nominations. It did get a bit of a cult following on the home market though, even if it never reached the level of its main series, and because of its disaster, the producers, the Salkins, decided against making any more Superman-related projects and sold the rights to Canon Films. There's never been a sequel, but there is a new Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow film in production that's slated for release in 2026 that isn't connected to this in any other way outside of being another adaptation of the comic character. And this movie's really not good, but it's enjoyable enough. I mean, it's a 3. It's just so cheesy that you certainly don't mind watching it, but it's definitely not on the level of any of her cousin's flicks. The SFCS is a 3.5 since it's a part of a majorly known franchise, and it did get a certain amount of cult popularity and of course, the comic fandom, but it's just not anywhere near the level it could have been or was achieved by any of the Superman films. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah, it's hokey, but it's still a good time.
And you'll put on your proper school uniform and get out of that ridiculous costume.
Yes, ma'am.
And cover your legs.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, speaking of spin-offs of much bigger franchises, let's take a trip to the small screen in a galaxy far, far, far away. Because on November 25th, it was time we went on the Ewok Adventure. It's set on the planet Endor, and is said to be set before the events of Return of the Jedi, and it starts with a family whose ship has crashed there, and the children have wandered off. But there's also this rather large creature there called the Gorax. And then we go to the Ewok village, those cuddly little Care Bears from Return. One of them is named Deej, and his kids are missing, so he goes to look for them, and Wicket is here too, once again played by Warwick Davis. Deej finds his littles, but also that ship, and inside they discover those two human children, Sindel and Mace, but Mom and Dad have been taken. They can't do anything right away and are forced to trust the Woks as they give them medicine and get the little one up and running again, but soon she's feeling okay and they want to go find their parents. It's not so easy though, as they have to face off against a big boar wolf thing with the little guy's help, and I should point out that Deej's kids are Tony Cox of Bad Santa fame and Debbie Lee Carrington from Total Recall. They seek out the help of Logray, another character from Jedi, and again played by Bobby Bell, who was under the suit there too. And this is pretty different from what you got in the film version, but Logray does actual magic to determine where their parents are, and they all team up to go defeat the Gorax and rescue the Rents. So, after the debacle that was the holiday special, George Lucas wanted more control over the spin-offs of the film series. They originally wanted to just do a short special, but no networks were interested. ABC said that they'd do it as a movie of the week, so they expanded the script to feature length. It was directed by John Cordy, who had previously done the animated film Twice Upon a Time, and it was given a budget of around $2 million to work with. It debuted in America, but played worldwide, and in some countries was dubbed Caravan of Courage, an Ewok Adventure, a title that a number of future home releases would also adopt. Although the ratings were just okay, it did really well and was the second highest rated ABC movie for the year, and was nominated for 2 Emmys, winning one for special visual effects. They would then spin off a number of children's books featuring the characters, although mostly just the Ewoks, but they subtitled them An Ewok Adventure to tie them back to this film. And if you're curious about whether or not this is Star Wars official, it kind of is. It was considered canon and takes place in 3ABY, which I'm pretty sure stands for After Baby Yoda, right? I'm pretty confident about that, so Star Wars fans, whatever you do, don't correct me in the comments. Don't do it. I guess after the Disney buyout, they revised that and said only the original 6 films and the Clone Wars movie and show were canon official. But it was said that references to them weren't off limits, and characters from here have shown up in novels since. The movie was also popular enough that a sequel would follow a year later, which we'll cover in '85. Oh, I should also say real quick that there's an unseen narrator for the whole film, and it's Burl Ives. And I'm just a 2.5 on this. I don't really have much nostalgia for it, and to be honest, there's not much going on. It's pretty dull overall, and unlike with Return of the Jedi, I actually wish there was more Ewok stuff going on. The significance is a 3, and being Star Wars related, I feel like I should have this higher, but it just never stuck, and really the only people seeking it out at this point are Star Wars completionists. Should you watch it? Maybe. If you're a fan of the franchise, I suppose it's an interesting entry, but I'll admit, it's not really all that fun to watch. We're ending this block on a much weirder, much smaller note because we're going to the small screen in the UK to check out Stars of the Roller State Disco. We're at a roller disco and it appears to be in the future as there's video identification and auto-opening doors, and this is no ordinary roller skate place. Instead, teenagers show up, sign up, get skates, and there's a bunch of cots in the middle. Then they just go around the loop, breaking to play video games or nap. Occasionally their names or numbers are called, and when that happens, they're given a job opportunity which they can then accept or deny. Carly's been there a while because he's not happy with the options coming his way, and Jason is just looking to go home, but his family won't take him if he doesn't have a job. We get little snippets of each of their stories, and they're allowed visitors. In fact, Carly's mom comes to see him to convince him to come home, but he doesn't want to go there either, seeming to want to stay at the disco. He also has a girlfriend who desperately wants him to get out of there, which is wild because he looks like an old man, trapped in a young body, and also Froggy from The Little Rascals. Any glimpses that we get of the outside world are just this big bright light, but we don't get to see out that door, and the kids just go round and round and round. And this odd little dystopian future is by director Alan Clark, and he was a long-standing British TV director and also did lower-budgeted flicks from time to time. This was another TV film and was done at the BBC Television Centre in a massive studio set. It's a full-throated satire of Margaret Thatcher's era of government and a large number of social issues at the time. Probably the wildest thing about this one is that it doesn't even really explain anything to you. It just drops you in the middle of this strange future and society and roller rink and leaves you to get up to speed on how things work on your own. It's clearly a low budget, shot on video, and all takes place in that one location. We never leave that roller disco. It's hard to say how well it performed or what the ratings were, but it's built itself a decent little cult following over time. And it's a cool little flick. I'll go 3.5 with it. This was a first-time watch, but I was immediately drawn into this weird world and environment, and even though it's not the most action-packed film, it's always moving, kind of like those skating kids. The SFCS is just A1 though, because it's really obscure, not much talked about, and doesn't feature faces that you'll really recognize, although maybe if you're in the UK. Should you watch it? Yeah, strap on your skates and give it a go.
Soft pine louvered cupboards for DIY rabbit hutches. And those mouse runs with the tinkly circle tread things that go round and round.
The beginning of the end happens on December 7th as we close out this mega year of sci-fi with another heavy hitter and look at 2010, the year we made contact. And yeah, that came and went, and no one was looking to talk to us. It starts with a recap of 2001 and tells us that Dave is still missing and presumed dead. They received his last communication about the monolith that he saw outside the orbit of Io, Jupiter's moon. And then the music kicks in. You know the music. It's called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I feel like most people just know it as the 2001 music, but it was 70 years old when it was in that movie. Chief Brody is here, and he's designing the Discovery 2 in order to try to go to find what happened up there, and a Russian recruits him, saying that their ship will be ready sooner. But they need the Americans to reactivate HAL. At first, Floyd says no, but when they find out that the Discovery will likely crash before they can get to it, they end up agreeing to do it. One of the people going is Bob Balaban, who we saw not that long ago in Altered States, and he has another computer named Sal, and they have to try to sleep for several months on the trip. And one of the Russians is Mrs. Tingle in her American film debut. They get what Floyd thinks is a warning to stay away, but they locate the Discovery and wake up the others, including Dr. Emilio Lizardo. They manage to spacewalk over while war brews back on Earth, and they manage to reactivate HAL. But then, things kick into gear when they come face to face with that giant monolith. But will their questions be answered, and will they make contact? I'm assuming so, since the title says they do. So this is clearly a sequel to 2001, the Stanley Kubrick masterpiece adaptation of Arthur C. Clarke's novel. This one is also based on a Clarke novel, this one called 2010, Odyssey 2. They actually went to Kubrick about directing, but he wasn't interested at all. But it caught the attention of Peter Hyams, who had previously done Capricorn 1 and Outland, so he was no stranger to space epics. Hyams contacted Kubrick to get his blessing, and he gave it, but was more like, yeah, whatever, I don't care, more than it was, yes, do this with my endorsement. But after the original film, Stanley had all the sets and props destroyed so they wouldn't be reused, so everything had to be recreated from scratch, using footage and pics from 2001 as a reference. They got Keir Dullea to play Dave, and Douglas Rain to do the voice of Hal again, but the character of Haywood Floyd was in the original, although played by William Sylvester. In the time between 2001 and this film, though, he aged considerably, and the producers didn't feel like he could carry the film and wanted a little more star power, so Roy Scheider was brought in. The budget was hefty at $28 million, but when it came time for release, it struggled a bit. It couldn't push Beverly Hills Cop out of the #1 spot for its opening weekend, and then had some strong competition in the following weeks, but wound up with a respectable, although disappointing, $40 million. The reception was mixed, and the reviews couldn't help but compare it to the precursor, usually not in a favorable way. It did, however, manage to get nominated for 5 Academy Awards, although mostly for technical categories, and didn't win any of them. And I'll go 3 out of 5 on this. It's interesting, and I like some of what it's doing, but it's just so dry, and missing all the cool wonder that 2001 had. I almost wonder if I would like this more if I had never seen the original, since there's just no way to watch it without comparing. The science fiction cultural significance is a 3.5, since it was a well-known release and the sequel to one of the most influential sci-fi films of all time, but it just never quite hit the heights that one did. It's boosted by a strong cast, though, and quite a few recognizable genre faces. Should you watch it? Sure, make contact.
What's gonna happen?
Something wonderful.
Going down a very different road right now, we have a couple of entries remaining that don't have a known release date and are just said to have arrived in 1984, and the first one is Furious. It begins with a woman being chased by 3 men, and one of them does the Canadian yodel. And nice movie, eh? She's able to fight them off, kinda absurdly, but one of them gets the better of her and gets a hold of the claw thing that she's protecting. We then meet her brother Simon, and he knows she's dead, but I'm not sure how, since she died on top of a mountain, and I'm pretty sure that bad guy wasn't reporting her death. He is then retrieved by a bunch of guys who lead him away, and I guess he's a martial arts sensei? Then there's this other guy in a dojo, and we see him do some stuff, and look, it's hard to explain all this because not much is happening, and this is 15 minutes into the movie, and literally 5 words have been said, and they are yeah, and all right. Finally, though, there's some dialogue as Master Chan busts out some philosophy, and Simon is his former student, but that killer guy is here. So I suppose he works for Chan? Also, Chan appears to be the same age as Simon, but just has gray spray paint in his hair, and he tells him that he has to search to find several more lost items to return to him. And Simon meets up with several friends outside to help him in his quest. I don't know what these guys were doing there. It looks like they were just hanging out for no reason, and Simon just happened to bump into them. And man, what is next in this fever dream of a film? Well, they go to a little Chinese restaurant, basically right down the street where one of the relics are, but get into a brawl with a bunch of people. And if you ever wondered what fight choreographers do in a film and then just watch this film and realize that they didn't have one, so this is what you get. Simon is a solid martial artist, but just no one else is. And there's no way to describe this film. It's this weird, surreal nonsense with a fantasy edge to it. I should mention that Simon is Simon Rhee, and he's since become one of the biggest stuntmen in the industry and did work in The Dark Knight Rises and Inception and tons of other films, and is still active. Master Chan was actually his real-life brother, Philip Rhee, and the two were often together in films around this time. It was directed by Tim Everett and Tom Sartori, and neither one went on to direct a whole lot more, but they both have worked in other aspects of film. It said that this was shot in only 6 days, and they had planned for 7, but the Rhee brothers disappeared to Tijuana, and they filmed this without a script. Nearly every ounce of footage that was shot is in the finished film, including footage of this Devo-like band that doesn't seem to be playing music and are just here for no reason. And if you feel like I'm including a standard martial arts action flick, well, there's this magic where this guy turns into a pig.
I'm an comploter. Pepper is evil.
And the ultimate goal is to get to the astral plane, and the finale is a full-on magic battle, the likes of which you have never seen before. And this is a wild one. It's a 3.5. It's terrible, like really terrible, but also just so fascinating that I couldn't take my eyes off of it, and I had a ton of fun with it, likely for all the wrong reasons. The significance is just a 1 though, since it's not much spoken of and really obscure and doesn't have much in the way of known faces. Should you watch it? If you enjoy So Bad It's Good cinema, it's a must-see. Here's another one with an unknown 84 date, and we'll talk more about that later, but it did get a release in May of 88 in France, and maybe never played here at all, and it's The Panther Squad. It begins with a press conference announcing a new era of space exploration thanks to a new means of communication called the Space Jeep. But there's a group called Clean Space that opposes them polluting the universe, and like, am I supposed to be mad at them for that? They begin their devious plan and start kidnapping scientists and issuing demands, so they call in none other than Sybil Danning and her sumptuous sax, and she starts to organize a squad, a Panther Squad to be exact. One of them is Frank, played by Jack Taylor, who we saw not long ago in Pieces and El Cepo, and immediately gets into some trouble. And also, some wild leather outfits, and more fights, including one with this guy in a convincing wig. Their team is a collection of attractive, scantily clad women who go jumping in pools at the first opportunity, and when they get into fights, remember what I said about furious and fight choreographers? Well, that goes double here. There's then a string of adventures as they get into more fights and low-speed chase scenes, and our bad guy is played by Antonio Mayans, who we've seen in films like The Sinister Dr. Orloff, Revenge in the House of Usher, Mansion of the Living Dead, Oasis of the Zombies, basically any of Jess Franco's movies, but that guy wasn't involved here. And it was a French production by Pierre Chevalier, which might be the Frenchest name I've ever heard. And he'd done a number of films throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and this would end up being his final film. There's a silly story about how they didn't have enough money in the budget to get full costumes for all of the villains, and several of them had to just wear their own tennis shoes in the scene. So Danning improvised a line saying,
"Surrender or I'll blow your Nikes off,"
to try to cover for it a bit. Now, here's where the release confusion comes into play, because it was shot and completed in 1984, and possibly had screenings in France, although those weren't any official releases since that's listed as happening in 88. It's not known whether it screened at all in the US, but it did get a VHS release in 86, but it failed to make any sort of dent in the market. And this is a slog. It's a 1.5. There's a handful of fun to be had, but for the most part, it's a chore to get through. It's basically an exploitation film with no sex, no nudity, no violence, and nothing really of interest. The SFCS is a 1 since it's a blip on the scene and no one talks about it at all. Should you watch it? Likely not. This squad isn't worth joining.
I play football.
Oh, you do? What position?
What else? Kicker.
I want to say that this is the big one for this block, but there's like 3 or 4 here. And even though this one had a premiere on December 3rd, the 14th is when it went wide, and it's Dune. We start with Helen Lyle telling us that it's the year 10191, and there's this thing called the Spice that's the most desired thing in the universe, and possesses several otherworldly abilities, and can only be found on one planet in the entire galaxy called Arrakis. There's several planets that are in a vast empire ruled by several families and led by Emperor Shaddam. But there's also something called the Spacing Guild, which sort of runs the money and such, and are run by this creature with a butthole mouth. And Shanam tells of his plan to give Arrakis over to the House Atreides, one of the ruling families, but intend to have their enemies, the Harkonnen, attack them because he's afraid of some sort of secret army that they're building. And man, that's a lot of exposition to just drop on us all at once. We then meet one of the Atreides, Dale Cooper, and he's approached by Professor X, Al, and Ynir. We see him go through a physical test, using a new weapon they designed that utilizes sound, and his dad is Das Boot. He doesn't just go through a test of strength, but he also has to pass a test from Reverend Mother Mulliam, which he does, much to her surprise. But Chucky's also here, and he works for Baron Harkonnen, who is just this really gross man. And he's likely to trigger someone's trypophobia. His crew also consists of scary German guy as a doctor, and Bluto, and Sting, because what else would you call Sting? And I know you're watching this and saying, when? When will we see Sting in a steel thong? And the answer is, not quite yet, but soon. They make it to Arrakis and meet up with members of the Fremen, the native inhabitants, and their leader is Emperor Ming, and he shows them around, including one of the local wildlife, giant sandworms. Also, this guy is here, and we'll talk about him soon. And so is Linda Hunt, a woman who won an Oscar for playing a Chinese man. There's then betrayal, Jack Nance, big battles, and yep, steel thong.
Remember, walk without rhythm and we won't attract the worm.
If you walk without rhythm, you'll never learn. So where do I even begin here? This was an adaptation of the mega successful Frank Herbert novel from 1965 called Dune. There were previous attempts to adapt it, including a very famed one in the 70s by Alejandro Jodorowsky, and even Ridley Scott took a shot at it. Finally though, in the 80s, it landed with David freaking Lynch, who was fresh off of The Elephant Man. He hadn't heard of the book but read it and loved it and agreed to direct, and initially planned to stretch the story into 2 films, but it was eventually shrunk down into 1. The budget was around $40 million, very expensive at the time, and the filming was troubled since they shot in Mexico, in a small country with no communication infrastructure, and issues kept popping up. And then the rough cut was a whopping 4 hours long, which Lynch was able to whittle down to 3, but the studio and Moneymen felt that was too long and wanted a 2-hour version. And Dino De Laurentiis, producer, stepped in and shot new scenes to simplify things, like the narration at the beginning with Virginia Madsen. The intention was to have it be the first film in a franchise and adapt the other books of the series, and Lynch started working on a screenplay for a sequel, but then the film came out and flopped, making only $30 million in ticket sales. In its opening weekend, it only did $6 million, coming in second to Beverly Hills Cop, and soon after, any plans for follow-ups were tossed into the sand. It got weird a few years later when there was a TV version that ran for 3 hours and had a bunch of extra stuff in it, but it's not a director's cut, and in fact, Lynch denounced that version and had his name taken off of it. Several other alternate cuts and versions floated around, but the director wasn't involved in any of them and didn't like talking about the film at all. It had a toy line that flopped as hard as the film, as well as a comic book adaptation and even some games. Over time, it's developed a strong cult following though, and of course, in 2021 would be remade by Denis Villeneuve, who was allowed to split it into several parts. And those were far more successful, getting a 3rd part arriving in the near future that will adapt the 2nd book in the series for the first time. And I have a complicated relationship with Dune, so it's a 3. I like it, and I think it's doing some wild stuff, but it just feels like such a mess, and really did need that 2nd part to flesh it all out. Lynch is a master of visual styling though, and it looks great, even if some of the effects don't hold up. But it's a treat to watch, even if the story itself just never clicks. The SFCS is a 4 since it's Dune, but this version just never hit the heights it should have. It gets a strong score for having Lynch involved and a huge roster of stars, and it is really well known, but it hasn't been as influential as it could, and it didn't become that pop culture mainstay that it should have. Should you watch it? You should. Don't be afraid to do it, because fear is the mind killer. This is a pretty great moment right now, because I love this next one. And on the same day as Dune, December 14th, Starman was released. It begins with the Voyager 2 space probe, a real thing that was launched back in '77, and it contained a message to any life out there. And you know, that thing is still out there in space. It's so far out there that the radio transmissions we're getting from it are weakened, but we'll keep receiving them for a few more years. This thing is over 12.3 billion miles away right now, well past Pluto and in interstellar space, like the whole region between the stars. We also see Marion Ravenwood, and she's mourning the loss of her husband Scott and watching old movies of him. Terry the Toad is here too, and get ready for me to talk about this guy in like 2 years when he directs Trick or Treat. So a planet that intercepts the Voyager sends out a ship to Earth, and it crash lands in Wisconsin, right outside of Jenny's home. And it goes in, finds a lock of Scott's hair, and uses it to form a human body for itself. It rapidly goes from a Little Lebowski urban achiever to a full-grown dude, much to the shock of Jenny. He adjusts to the form and has these 7 little balls, and uses one of them to send a message home that he needs a pickup, and then uses another one to make a map showing Jenny where he has to go, making her drive him there. The government tracks the crashed ship though, and proceeds to try to track down whatever came out of it, with Sherman leading the way. As they go to Arizona, along the way Jenny tries to escape, but gradually she starts to realize that the visitor isn't the threat that she thought he was, and they start to form a bond. But they only have 3 days to get there, because if he misses his ship home, he'll die. But can they make it with the government at their heels? And this is the next project from my absolute favorite director, John Carpenter, and his return to the sci-fi project as opposed to the horror one, as this film was a change of pace for him. It seems like the script had been floating around for years and caused some issues. The original draft was by Bruce Evans and Reynold Gideon, but when they were asked to do a rewrite, it was rejected. So instead, Dean Reisner, Dirty Harry screenwriter, was hired to do his version. And then another, and then another. He did 5 full rewrites of it, for a total of 6 different directors, with Carpenter the final edition. But when they tried to get Reisner credit for it, the Writers Guild denied it, crediting only Evans and Gideon, even though the finished product no longer resembled their version of the story. Carpenter was so angry they said no, that he gave Reisner a dedication in the film, an act that ticked off the Guild so much that they threatened to force Columbia Pictures to destroy any prints of the film that included the dedication. Meanwhile, Carpenter chose to make the film since he was still trying to repair his status in Hollywood after the failure of The Thing and the medium success of Christine, and felt that this was a nice, safe choice. But the gamble didn't work, since the film was up against too much competition and opened at number 6 in its opening weekend, going up against both Dune and 2010, and only earned around $29 million on a budget of $24. The reviews were good though, and even earned Jeff Bridges an Oscar nomination for Best Actor, which isn't bad considering that he said his whole thing was just acting like a bird, but he lost out to F. Murray Abraham for Amadeus. I guess it had a good enough of a reputation to get a TV show spin-off in 1986, which lasted for 1 season and recast the Starman as Ted Stryker, and featured the alien returning to Earth to meet his son and locate Jenny. There was also an attempt to remake it around 2016 or so with Sean Levy, director of Deadpool and Wolverine. He was set to oversee it, but it didn't happen, and he says that the trouble was finding a good script. And I do really enjoy Starman, and it's a 4 from me. Like, sure, some of what it's doing felt really familiar and maybe a little too E.T., but it has such a human touch to it, and wonderful characters. It shows off a side of Carpenter that we don't get to see too often. The significance is a 3 since it's pretty well known and had a lot of cable play and cult cred, but it's never been a major deal and didn't impact the genre at all at the time and is still likely one of the lesser seen of the director's filmography. Should you watch it? Yep, it's as good as Dutch apple pie.
What's the matter?
We're staying on December 14th, which was apparently a big time for sci-fi flicks, but we're veering a touch more into the action world with Runaway. Magnum is here and he's a police officer, and Stan Shaw is here too, who I most associate with getting blown up in Monster Squad. They're part of a robotics division because we're set in the near future and Ramsey gets a new partner in Thompson. She's played by Cynthia Rhodes, and it's funny because she was mostly known as a dancer. Her biggest roles were in Dirty Dancing, dancing, Flashdance, dancing, Staying Alive, dancing, and this, presumably no dancing. Ramsey has a fear of heights, and it seems that once he stopped chasing a suspect because of the fear, and then that guy killed 6 people, so he quit the force to focus on robots. They make use of these things called floaters to go into crime scenes, like basically a drone, and Chris Mulkey is here too, and we just saw him for a brief second in Dreamscape. Ramsey has a kid who's also a navigator, and his wife died a few years back, and we see him work on a couple of cases of bots gone wild. And on one of them they find records of a suspicious fellow who looks a lot like Velvet von Ragnar. And pretty soon after, Johnson is killed by some sort of heat-seeking missile bot. Turns out that Luther is involved in a plot to override robot safety codes and allow them to attack humans, and wants to sell off his newest invention as a weapon. And Rebecca Howe is involved. Ramsey's chief is Lieutenant Harris, or Captain Harris, or I guess here, Chief Harris, and their adventure involves exploding bullets, little tracking bomb bots, and finally, the thing this movie is the most known for, the acid spider bots. So, this one has a higher pedigree that you'd expect because it's both written and directed by Michael Crichton, and we've had him on the project before with Looker, but he also wrote the Jurassic Park novels, the Andromeda Strain, and was the creator of the TV show ER. Selleck was a big TV star at the time and did films when he could fit them into his schedule, and was excited to work with Crichton, but it was the first film role for Simmons outside of Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. But then, and something that's going to sound like a broken record for this block, it was a bomb. First up, the reviews weren't great. No one outright trashed it, but it was seen as a mediocre film that didn't do enough with its premise. It was a lower budget than a number of the other films on here since it only cost $8 million to make, but it debuted at number 7, below both Dune and Starman, and only made $1.2 million in the opening weekend, and only $7 million overall. It did get a fair amount of cable play, but somewhat quickly faded from the public eye. And it's cool. It's a 3. All of the stuff that's robot-oriented I like, but there's not as much of it as you're hoping, and a good deal just feels like a standard action flick. A decent standard action flick, though. The SFCS is a 2.5 since it did get some recognition on the secondary market and has a whole lot of names attached, but it was a flop that left no mark on the industry and just didn't have the necessary staying power. Should you watch it? Yeah, I mean, those spiders are pretty cool. Not everything is a huge release, as we're about to see here, because this next one was a much smaller film that showed up on the same day. So we're still on December 14th, although in Australia, and we now have Lorca and the Outlaws. It says we're on a mining station on a planet called Ordessa, and it's supplying fossil fuels to other planets, but the workers are stretched thin and are angry about the conditions there. They start to protest, but the oppressive regime doesn't want them to do that, so they sent in a bunch of robot thugs to keep the voice of the people at bay. Of course, they start attacking them and claiming they started it, which sounds real damn familiar, And a young man named Lorca goes to help out a group of kids who have a robotic teacher. The androids just wipe out any of the resistance, including Lorca's mom, and he goes on the run into the wasteland, along with Kid, or Grid. Under that creepy mask is Deep Roy, who we just saw in the NeverEnding Story, and he gets captured by the droids, who I should mention all have Asian accents. Their intention is to replace the human workers with the robots, and G, also sounding familiar, and then suddenly there's a musical number that sounds suspiciously like Peter Gabriel, but we'll come back to that. Seems that a few other members of the Resistance made it out alive and saved Kid/Grid and went to find Lorca and try to get back to stop the wholesale slaughter in time. This one was directed and co-written by Roger Christian, who we talked about in the 1982 version of The Horror Project, where he directed The Sender. This is a man with an Academy Award, although one for art direction on Star Wars, and he was nominated for another on Alien. And I'll point out again that he is destined to direct what is referred to as one of the worst films of all time, Battlefield Earth. It was intended to be a sequel to 1984 in a way, and it was done independently due to Christian's difficult time with Paramount while making The Sender. It was originally released as Lorca and the Outlaws, although the working title was Starship, and later releases would have that title. Also, the version released in the US was altered, chopping out around 10 minutes of runtime, and they changed the voice of Grid to a British accent. I should also mention that depending upon who is saying it, Deep Roy's character is sometimes called Kid and sometimes Grid, and is named in the credits as Kid. The budget was $1.5 million, but it wasn't very successful, getting called a Star Wars clone with a dash of Mad Max, and quickly faded away. Oh, and yeah, that was Peter Gabriel as that futuristic singer, as the music here was by Tony Banks of Genesis, and he asked his former bandmate to contribute some vocals and do that little appearance there. And this is mostly kinda I'll give it a 2. The concepts are cool, but the execution is so flat. It just feels like it's going out of its way to be uninteresting. There's not one thing that feels fresh or original. The significance is just a 1.5 since it wasn't a success, and even though Christian had a bigger name with the genre, not as a director. Should you watch it, you can let this starship fly away. We've now arrived at the ending of the year for Sci-Fi, and I can't think of a bigger way to end it. And when I mean big, I mean about 50 meters tall, since on December 15th, in Japan, we saw The Return of Godzilla. To clarify, this is the Japanese version called The Return of Godzilla from '84, and not the American version called Godzilla 1985, which I'll cover later on. It starts with this little fishing boat, and they see a little island have a volcanic eruption, and a very familiar roar emits from it. Later, a reporter finds the boat at sea and discovers everyone dead inside except for Okamura and a giant sea louse that attacks. Okamura tells everybody about the monster that he believes he saw, and some government officials show him pictures of Godzilla, and he confirms that it was him. They believe that he was sleeping under the ocean and the volcanic eruptions of the island woke him up, and Maki goes to see a professor whose parents died back in the '54 attacks. He says that Godzilla is immortal, and just by coincidence, Okamura's sister works for him. Meanwhile, a Russian sub gets trashed by the big guy, which kicks off an international incident, so in an effort to avert World War III, the Japanese release all of their information about the existence of the G-Man. In order to fight back, they develop something called the Super X, described as a flying fortress, but before it's completed, he shows up at a nuclear power plant and we get our first solid look at Godzilla and his glazed over eyes. He does his required damage, smashing up some buildings, and slurps up some delicious radiation until a pack of birds flies overhead, and he follows them. They notice this and they plan to try to lure the dude to an active volcano and drop him in there, but before they can get their plan in action, he makes landfall, and with a purposeful grimace and a terrible sound, he pulls the spitting high-tension wires down. Then, there's helpless people on a subway train, and they screamed bug-eyed as he looks in on them. And then, oh no, there goes Tokyo. Look, he's got to go. And this was a big moment. This is the 16th film in the franchise, but it was the first one in almost 10 years, since the last film was 1975's Terror of Mechagodzilla. This entry ignores everything but the first film, and even though it's not directly stated in this entry, this is a different Godzilla than appeared in the 54 film, since that guy was turned into a skeleton. This is a different mutation, as we learn in one of the later films. It was directed by Koji Hashimoto, the director of Bye Bye Jupiter, which I covered earlier in this year, and was actually the last movie that he'd direct. So, in the early 70s, the popularity of Godzilla had massively faded, so they put him on ice for a while. But there were attempts to bring him back before this, since in 77, there was supposed to be a remake of the original. And there was also an attempt to make Godzilla vs. the Devil, which I'm really angry that we never got to see. Right before this, there was actually a stab at making an American version, with Steve Miner directing, with a script by Fred Decker, which I'm also angry we never got to see. But we did get this, and they made a big effort to go back to the roots of the character and not have him be a goofy good guy, and he'd once again be a force of destruction. The budget was around $6 million, and it did quite well over there, earning around $14 million in return, which was considered a disappointment. In order to try to drum up more cash, they turned to America and sold it to New World Pictures, who released it as Godzilla in 1985, but we'll get to that in the 85 episodes, as it's quite a bit different. And I'm a 3.5 here. I like it fine, but it's not doing what I'm really looking for in a Godzilla flick. It's taking the first film and sort of reworking it, but taking out the darker, moodier aspects and the political stuff, and it just feels blander. It's still a stomp a good time though. The SFCS is a 2, and I realize that you'll be upset by that, but I'm talking in specific relation to this version of the film. Not the American release, which I'll cover soon, but this version, the Japanese language version, didn't have much impact over here and wasn't seen as much as the dubbed edition with Raymond Burr, so its significance to the genre was less overall. Rest assured, the rating on Godzilla 1985 will be higher. Should you watch it? Yes, this is the preferred version to check out, and if you enjoy the big guy, it's a must-see. So there you have it, that closes out the year, but let's check out all the movies from my top rank to the bottom. Okay, and just like the previous years, we're going to end with doing a sort of a best of for the movies, an idea that was originated in a series called Horror Movie Superlatives that was done by your friendly neighborhood Uncle Pete and Carlin Cook on their channels, and it's sort of a yearbook-style awards setup for the movies. For Best FX, I'm going to go ahead and give that to Ghostbusters. There's just such a cool mix of practicals and opticals going on there. A lot of puppets, a lot of different things. It's great effects. For the Best So Bad It's Good, this could only go to Voyage of the Rock Aliens. The movie's so terrible and so much fun. It's such an enjoyable flick. For the most WTF, I'm going a different route here, and I'm going to give this to Threads. This movie is so dark and so depressing. Every few seconds, you're just like, what's next? What is going to happen? This is just make it stop. With most unique, I'm going to go ahead and give that to Nothing Lasts Forever. Just nothing else this year felt like that. Has a bunch of big stars in it, and just such a confusing narrative and such an interesting way of doing it. For the most overrated, I'm sadly going to give that to Runaway. I guess I'm the one that rated this one, because I went in to go rewatch this movie and I was super excited about doing it. Because my memory of it was that it was a lot of fun and really cool, and it was just kind of okay. For the most underrated, I'm giving this to Buckaroo Banzai. This movie is not the legend that it should be. I feel like there should be a laundry list of sequels of this film. I feel like everyone should know it and everyone should see it. And finally, as the most amazing sci-fi movie of 1984, this could only be The Terminator. It's the only perfect ranked movie that I gave to this entire year. I love it. It is a perfect film. I think The Terminator is easily the most amazing movie of this year. I like it more than the sequel. I know that some people don't, but I think it's just phenomenal. So there's the entire year wrapped up in a bow. Let me know where you would have put in each one of those categories down below in the comments below. What was your most amazing sci-fi film of 1984 out of the roster that you saw above? Tell me that. I want to hear it. Also, if you like this video, hit that like button. If you enjoy the channel, subscribe to it and hit the bell to get notified about videos when they get posted. And also check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support this channel and keep the project going. And yeah, we're going to keep going. We're going to move on to 1985, coming on really soon, right here on the Sci-Fi Project.